Benvenuti qui e io spero che queste giornate siano per voi fruttuose. Fatemi ringraziare il Presidente dell'Istituto di Studi Gentiliani che è qui presente, il Professor Lacché, e non vedo ancora la Dottoressa Pepe Ragoni, che è la sostanza di questa iniziativa. Vabbè, la saluterò quando entrerà. È un grande piacere anche ringraziare gli amici Giampaolo Ruotolo e Beatrice Bonafè, Fulvio Palombino, che sono venuti qui appositamente per discutere con voi. Mais laissez-moi aussi remercier beaucoup Monsieur Olivier Courten qui a accepté notre invitation. Je dis l'invitation du bureau de la SIDI, de la Société italienne pour les droits internationaux et les droits de l'Union européenne, de venir ici. Monsieur Courten n'a pas besoin d'être introduit par moi. Je crois qu'il donnera une contribution sans doute significative à notre rencontre. Je le remercie encore une fois d'avoir accepté ces longs voyages de Bruxelles à ici. J'espère aussi qu'il ait la possibilité de bénéficier des marques. Et je ne sais pas s'il y aura du temps pour voir quelque chose d'autre. Merci beaucoup Olivier d'être venu. E dunque io non metterei altre cose in bando, io non sono portato per fare i saluti istituzionali e quindi vi chiedo scusa anche di questo, oltre che del ritardo perché mi sveglio tardi la mattina, ho difficoltà di addormentamento. E dunque non so ora il programma che cosa prevede. Un videomessaggio della professoressa Angela Di Stasi, segretario generale della SIDI, che ha voluto così rimarcare la sua vicinanza, la sua prossimità a voi all'incontro. Prego.
Buongiorno, ricorro a questo videomessaggio che vuole testimoniare la mia particolare vicinanza ai lavori del 12° incontro tra dottorandi di ricerca in diritto internazionale e in diritto dell'Unione Europea Alberico Gentili. Devo dire che sono veramente dispiaciuta del fatto di non riuscire ad essere con voi in ragione della coincidenza di un impegno istituzionale che mi ha impedito di allontanarmi dalla mia sede universitaria. E allora affido un ringraziamento e un saluto a questo videomessaggio che sarà molto breve al fine di non togliere spazio allo svolgimento dei lavori. Un ringraziamento sentito in primo luogo rivolto al Centro Internazionale di Studi Gentiliani che ha consentito ancora una volta la realizzazione di questo incontro tra dottorandi, al suo presidente Luigi Lacché anche per la Lexio Gentiliana che ci offrirà e a Pepe Ragoni per la sua consueta dedizione alla perfetta riuscita di questa importante iniziativa. Un ringraziamento di cuore al professor Courten che ci onora della sua presenza e che terrà il keynote speech su un tema così attuale e anche così complesso quale la guerra e le sue trasformazioni. Un grazie a tutti i colleghi che con ruoli diversi coordineranno e animeranno questo 12° incontro, a Beatrice Bonafè, ad Andrea Caligiuri, a Federico Casolari, a Giampaolo Ruotolo e dulcis in fundo al presidente della SIDI Pasquale De Sena, al vicepresidente Fulvio Palombino e al consigliere Giovanni Zarra. Un saluto, se mi permettete, particolarmente affettuoso agli 8 dottorandi di ricerca del 3° anno e a tutti gli uditori che vivranno quella che, ne sono convinta, sarà un'esperienza particolarmente stimolante. D'altra parte, gli incontri precedenti hanno attestato le potenzialità insite in questo momento di confronto e di arricchimento culturale tra studiosi del diritto internazionale pubblico e privato e del diritto dell'Unione Europea, impegnati in un percorso post lauream di particolare rilievo, quale rappresentano gli studi dottorali. L'incontro di San Ginesio è ormai una consolidata occasione di crescita culturale, professionale e anche umana, e costituisce sicuramente una delle buone prassi di una società scientifica quale la SIDI, che rinviene una forte spinta propulsiva nella presenza in qualità di soci di tanti giovani studiosi. Devo dire che ho letto con particolare attenzione i vostri abstract, che lasciano intuire la realizzazione di percorsi di ricerca accurati intorno a temi di diritto internazionale pubblico, di diritto internazionale privato e di diritto dell'Unione Europea. Percorsi di ricerca relativi a temi in alcuni casi sicuramente innovativi o quantomeno declinati alla luce di prospettive di indagine innovative, talora collocate, per così dire, nell'intersezione tra diversi ordinamenti giuridici e sistemi normativi. Sono dunque convinta che il dibattito scientifico che si svilupperà non tradirà queste premesse, e sono certa che questo incontro saprà offrire un contributo in quella direzione indicata dal decreto ministeriale 226 del 2021, che, come sapete, ha riconosciuto l'importanza dei corsi di dottorato quali strumenti imprescindibili per la formazione ai fini della ricerca, ma anche quali chiave per il raggiungimento di autonomia scientifica e di capacità innovativa, che risulta essere strategica per l'intero sistema paese. Il tutto senza trascurare l'acquisita consapevolezza dell'importanza degli studi dottorali, come provano le nuove linee guida ANVUR dello scorso febbraio 2023 per l'accreditamento, mi riferisco ad AVA 3, laddove i corsi di dottorato e in particolare l'assicurazione della qualità degli stessi concorrono significativamente all'accreditamento delle sedi universitarie e dei corsi di studio. Dunque, in questo quadro di rafforzata centralità normativa degli studi dottorali, che, ahimè, non sempre è adeguatamente colto dai nostri laureati, io formulo a Giulia Grati, a Giulia Bosi, a Veronica Botticelli, a Marianna Bianca Galantucci, a Lorenzo Grossio, a Marta Stroppa, a Davide Vaira e a Federica Velli, formulo i migliori auguri per un futuro professionale che vi consenta di raggiungere una formazione dottorale di qualità idonea a massimizzare le offerte del Programma Nazionale per la Ricerca 2021-2027. Buon lavoro!
Benissimo, scusate se riprendo la parola per scusarmi con Federico Casolari che non ho citato, ma questo dipende sempre dai miei risvegli traumatici della mattina. Per il resto, diciamo, l'inquadramento normativo è stato fatto dalla professoressa Di Stasi, quindi io non porrei tempo in mezzo e inviterei il professor Olivier Courten e la professoressa Beatrice Bonafè a venire qui se desiderano, se vogliono, e a dar vita a questo diciamo primo pezzo del nostro incontro, che contempla una relazione, una presentazione del professor Courten sul tema della guerra e le sue trasformazioni. Il professor Courten è un grande studioso. Io non riesco a dire per il professor Courten esperto, è un grande studioso della guerra in tutte le sue sfaccettature, in particolar modo dal punto di vista di ciò che il diritto può fare in rapporto alla guerra, e quindi sicuramente ci darà da par suo, da maestro di questa materia, qual è un quadro interessante. Se volete prendere posto, io vi lascio volentieri il palco.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous et merci pour l'invitation qui me permet de découvrir non pas cette région que j'ai déjà eu l'occasion de parcourir dans le passé à Macerata il y a quelques années, mais maintenant la petite ville ou le village de San Ginesio qui, en dépit du temps un peu maussade, me paraît tout à fait charmant. Je vais donc faire un exposé en anglais sur les transformations de la guerre et c'est donc sur cette thématique que l'on m'a demandé d'introduire cette journée. Je suis très heureux donc de pouvoir le faire avec vous et je dois dire que la formule de rencontre avec des doctorants que la société italienne organise est vraiment un modèle puisque même si, comme je le disais en arrivant ici, ces choses-là existent évidemment ailleurs, le fait de se réunir dans un endroit comme celui-ci pendant 2 jours entre vous est quelque chose sans doute qui va créer des liens que vous n'auriez peut-être pas eu si c'était pour une demi-journée par exemple. Donc vraiment bravo pour cette initiative. So my topic will be dedicated to the transformation of war, and I would like to start with a statement made by Russian officials a few days ago on the 21st of March, when a new document was published about Russian foreign policy, according to which, and I quote, Western states used the pretext of the Ukrainian war to, and I quote then, unleash a new type of hybrid war against Russia. And so here it's interesting because Russia takes this expression of hybrid war, which was originally expressed against Russia, to condemn Russia for the military actions. Of course, now for a little more than 1 year in eastern and actually in all the parts of Ukraine. But before that, in 2014, during the invasion of Crimea. This expression of hybrid war is characteristic of a new discourse about wars, the idea being that there are new types of war, characterized perhaps by 2 main characteristics, 2 main elements. First, the use of a wide range of actors to wage war, not only conventional means like soldiers, officials, the army of a state, but also by private actors, like irregular groups, like it was the case in Crimea at the beginning of the invasion, or mercenaries, or private military companies, like the Wagner Group in Russia, for example. So the first characteristic would be the use of different actors, and the second characteristic would be new methods of warfare, conventional methods, bombing, invading a country, like we can now see in Ukraine, but also non-conventional with the economic weapon, with also cyber attacks, with also what is called a war of information, and even with the use of migrants, of refugees, for example. It was very interesting to note that in 2021, when many refugees came to the borders of Poland and Lithuania, the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, denounced an hybrid attack against Europe. So here we have a wide range of methods that would be used to wage war against another country. And Russia takes this argument back in its favor, like it did for other arguments, and we will come to that later, and contend that it is the Western states and NATO that wage an hybrid war against Russia. What does it mean? Of course, this expression means that if, for example, a move of refugees to your boundaries is an act of war, well, it could justify a riposte that could be also traduced in act of war. So, of course, this expression tends, on the one hand, to describe a reality, and on the other hand, to justify a possible riposte. Of course, it is telling that this expression was, at the beginning in the 2000s, framed by, in certain military circles, justifying a strengthening of NATO means to combat the war against terror, like it was named at that time. At the same time, it is presented like something new, this hybrid war, but it is really the case. We don't have to be a great specialist of war to observe that, obviously not. Of course, there are some new means of warfare, like perhaps cyber attacks particularly, but the idea to use different kinds of actors and different means of warfare to attack a country is far from new. It's perhaps a very classical way to target a country. Briefly, here we can come back to a very classical and topical case, which is the Nicaragua precedent, in which the title almost speaks for itself. Military and paramilitary actions against Nicaragua. Here we had a wide range of actions made by the US against Nicaragua. We had conventional actions, if we may say, mining territorial waters of Nicaragua, intrusion of military aircrafts in the Nicaraguan airspace, but we had also support to irregular groups, the Contras, were supported militarily, financially, and so forth by the United States. We had also the economic weapon with an embargo established in 1985. And we had also this psychological warfare. Very interesting to read once again certain excerpts of the case. As you know, the CIA elaborated 2 manuals, actually, given to the Contras, and one of them was named Manual of Psychological Warfare, and to quote certain excerpts which are cited in the case, the aim was to, I quote, neutralize carefully selected and planned targets, such as court judges, for example. So very impressive. And I quote once again, if possible, professional criminals will be hired to carry out specific jobs. Of course, it was condemned by the courts, all those actions, as in this latter case, indiscriminate violence against civilians that were encouraged by the United States. But here, so we observe that it is not new to use different actors and different means of warfare. But if you take this from a legal perspective, the court distinguished very carefully different aspects of this hybrid war, if we, with a certain form of anachronism, characterize the intervention of the United States in Nicaragua. The court distinguished, had a very formalistic view, distinguished different aspects, and condemned certain aspects as a violation of the non-use of force, other as a violation of the principle of non-intervention, and other aspects, as the last one, as a violation of international humanitarian law. And I think that what is at stake here is really this opposition between, on the one hand, the idea that you have a hybrid war and therefore you could also respond with military means, on the one hand, and on the other hand, by contrast, another perspective, more formalistic, more strictly legal perspective, that would imply that no, you cannot envisage this kind of different kind of actions globally, but you must distinguish every action and judge it in relation to a specific rules. And to avoid any confusion, of course, because otherwise it would make possible for the victim state of an hybrid action to use force for every kind of action, if you understand. I mean, even if you are just the victim of a flux of refugees, victim with brackets, you could consider it like an act of war. It was the statement made by the EU authorities, and possibly to respond with military means. And I would like to illustrate it briefly with two points. The first is the idea of blurring or preserving the different thresholds that exist in general international law. And the second point is more methodological, it's more in relation with an approach. It's to blur, here again, the risk for me is to blur the distinction between a strictly legal perspective on the one hand, and on the other hand, a sort of confusion between legal and political approach. So the first point, here we have, if we take classical international law like expressed by the court in Nicaragua, once again, you have different levels of force or intervention that are strictly distinguished so that the reaction should correspond to the level that you would that would be reached. So the first level, we have at least 4 levels. The first level is an act of coercion, but not a military coercion. Here we have a violation of the principle of non-intervention, and like the court said, you cannot respond with an act of force. So, for example, war of information, flux of refugees, economic weapons are possibly, but you must, of course, establish on a case-by-case basis. It's a violation of international law, but it's not, it's level 1. It's not a use of force. We are not in the military domain, so the riposte cannot be a military riposte. First level. Second level, a threat to use force. Here we have a violation of Article 2.4. And the third level is a genuine use of force, of military force, and we have also a violation of Article 2.4. However, as the court insisted in Nicaragua, it does not mean that the victim state can riposte militarily, because here we are in the domain of the competence of the Security Council, threat to international peace and security, breach of peace, so you can seize the Security Council so that the Council could take coercive measures as it has done in the past in several situations, at least since 1999. But it is only in level 4, with the level of an armed attack, according to international law as specified in the definition of aggression, adopted in 1974, that here you have the possibility to riposte for the victim states unilaterally. Of course, you must see the Security Council, but if the Security Council is unable or unwilling to take any necessary measure to put an end to the armed attack. The victim state can riposte militarily immediately. So we have 4 levels, and it is only in the 4th level that then a military riposte is possible, at least unilaterally. Of course, if you are in level 2 or 3, it can happen that the Security Council take military measures and authorizes a use of force. But so those thresholds are very rigorously distinguished, in the contrary of an hybrid war taken as a whole. Here we have a risk that is not new, that the risk is to a confusion between those thresholds. For example, between threshold 3 and 4, some scholars and states consider that in the name of necessity, very broadly defined, if you are a victim of a use of force, which is not equivalent to a serious use of force, a frontier boundary incident, for example, you could react if it is proportional by military means. It was a first tendency that you can observe in literature and in the position of certain states. A second declination of this confusion, possible confusion of threshold, is of course preventive war, because here you have a confusion between level 1, 2, and 3. If you reach level 3, it would be sufficient. What is a threat? Here we have different scenarios. The first is an imminent threat, but it is not defined, and we must remind that, for example, during Second World War, Germany and Japan with Pearl Harbor considered that they were the subject of an imminent threat from the Allied forces, so that they could react in self-defense, and it is precisely because of that in the Charter, in Article 51, enouncing the right to self-defense, the notion of threat was carefully avoided in order to avoid this kind of argument. But still, it is still supported today by many states and scholars that an imminent threat would be equivalent to force and even to an armed attack. So confusion between level 3 to 1, and for some scholars and possibly states, even a non-imminent threat would be sufficient. So here we have a problem of definition with other levels inside level 3, if you understand. So level 3, imminent or not imminent. And here, with this notion of hybrid war, we could possibly have, it's another step, we could have a confusion between levels 1, 2, 3, 4, because an act of coercion, even none without any use of military means, or even without any threat to use force, because the threat, of course, is linked to a use of force, you could riposte militarily. And of course, it's dangerous, and it is what is at stake here when we speak about an hybrid war. We have, of course, different possible scenarios. The intrusion of an aircraft or of a drone, for example, would be equivalent not only to a violation of sovereignty, but to an act of force and even an armed attack. Migrants, as I've said, or, for example, what happened in Salisbury a few years ago, an assassination of an opponent by agents abroad, by Russia, would be equivalent, it is what the UK said, to an armed attack. So we have this level required to invoke self-defense that would become very low. This is so the first problem, according to me, of this notion of hybrid war. The second problem, of course linked to the first one, is linked to the approach we have. If we take, I would say, once again, classical international law, and here again the Nicaragua case is very instructive, we must distinguish the legal perspective and the political perspective. And the court was very clear about that, first by distinguishing practice and opinio juris, because, as you know, the task of the course was to establish the state of customary international law. And the court, very subtly, considered that, of course, you can have a practice of violation, but this is only if it is accompanied by a proclamation of a genuine legal argument that could lead to a transformation of customary law. And the court said, for example, that the US had a certain practice of intervention, but didn't advanced a new argument according to which, for example, they had the right to intervene in the name of the defense of democracy, for example. According to the court, of course, certain statements made by the Reagan administration at the time were made, but they were the expression of, I quote, statements of international policy, and not the expression of a proper legal argument. So on the one hand, you can have something, and I quote once again, justified on the political level, but on the other hand, it's not sufficient. You must point out certain genuine legal arguments, so justified on the legal level. Here, if we take this notion of hybrid war, this distinction is blurred once again. We have seen that in the past with certain precedent, long before the Ukrainian war. For example, during the war against Yugoslavia in 1999, this idea of a special case, of a sui generis case, led to certain positions and statements in which it was very difficult to distinguish a legal argument from a moral argument. When certain said it was legitimate, legal, it was not very easy to determine what was the legal argument. Was it a genuine right to humanitarian intervention? It was the position of the UK, it was clear, but the other states weren't so clear. For some of them, like France, it appeared that it was rather some kind of intervention covered by resolutions of the Security Council. Others hesitated. Belgium, for example, sometimes spoke about a right to humanitarian intervention, but soon said the Kosovo war was not a precedent at all, legally speaking, so it was not very clear. During the war against terror, once again, the notion of self-defense was used. It was not always clear if it was a proper legal argument with all the requirements, or just a political argument in the name of security of the states concerned. And of course, in the Ukrainian war, we have also this kind of statements that are not very easy to interpret. If you take particularly the official justification made by Russia on the 24th of February of last year, with this discourse of President Putin, which was annexed to the letter sent to the Security Council, it's not easy. And because on the one hand, it was the argument of self-defense that was used, but on the other hand, we have here two problems. First, was it the only argument? Because Russia contended that the special military operation, and here again we have not a very clear designation of what happened, was justified to put an end to a genocide caused against Russian, speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of Ukraine. So here we could have a reference to a right to humanitarian intervention. This is why Ukraine put the case before the ICJ. But then Russia said, no, it's not a legal argument at all. It was just a political argument. It was part of an environment, an intellectual environment, explaining our legal argument, which is only self-defense. But clearly, it was not so clear. And the same could be said about, for example, the justification of the Russian actions in Crimea, or even sooner in Georgia in 2008. So some kind of confusion between moral or legal arguments referring to a responsibility to protect, for example, to a genocide, which is, of course, a legal concept, but without clearly deducing a right to intervene, but suggesting this. So here again, blurring the distinction between legal and political justification. Second problem with this argument advanced by Russia, okay, it is self-defense, but which kind of self-defense? Because if you read the statement, you have on the one hand some kind of preventive self-defense, and on the other some kind of collective self-defense. The preventive dimension is, of course, deduced from this idea according to which, and we come back here to this notion of hybrid war, Russia would be threatened by a NATO policy for years, that Russia is not obliged to wait until a genuine armed attack would be launched against them, like it was the case during the Second World War, that Russia therefore is entitled to prevent this kind of aggression coming from the West. So a preventive dimension of self-defense, what is that? Is it really what was it invoked? It's not clear. Because if you read the letter sent to the Security Council, you have simply a reference to Article 51, and in the annex you have this discourse of President Putin, which of course is not only framed on a legal, with legal terms, so it's not clear. Because you have a second possibility, which is collective self-defense, in my view, which is perhaps the genuine legal argument made by Russia. And here it's different, because the idea would be Russia has not been attacked yet, so far, but two other states have been attacked, and those two other states would be the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, which were recognized, if you remember, 3 days before the launching of the attack. And then, according to Russia, an armed attack would have happened, but it is not clear, either during the 3 days preceding the intervention or even before, but if it is before, it was not an armed attack against another country, but only the use of force inside a state, so it's not very clear once again. But still, in the idea, at least during those 3 days, the Ukrainian military actions in the eastern part of Ukraine would have become an armed attack by a state, Ukraine, against two other states. And then, in the name of collective self-defense, Russia would have been entitled to riposte in support of those two states. But of course, it's an interpretation. It's not very clear. Here again, if you look at the discourse as a whole, you have a certain kind of confusion between political, moral, with this idea of genocide, of massacres, of thousands of Ukrainians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East, and legal arguments. So in conclusion, just to sum up what I've said, the notion of hybrid war is perhaps fashionable, a fashionable expression, like it was wrote by some authors. But beyond this new terminology, there is something more important that is at stake. This risk of confusion on a substantive, if you take the substance of the law between different thresholds, and if you take perhaps a more general dimension like the approach you must take as a lawyer to assess the legality of a given action, this idea here to have a possible confusion between legal and political consideration. And in my view, our task is perhaps to refuse to enter this kind of logic and to be very careful and to distinguish if you have a hybrid war, every action that composes this war, and to determine the legality of this action according perhaps to a different regime. The regime of a non-use of force is very specific, and to broaden it is, in my view, not only dangerous, but also is not in conformity with what was conceived in the past when it was elaborated, but also what is accepted still today, because I've spoken a lot about Russian or Western NATO justifications, but if you look at the position of the majority of the UN members, it is clear that they are rather in support of an orthodox legal perspective. Thank you for your attention.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Great. So let me just say a few words to thank the Società Italiana di Diritto Internazionale for their invitation and for the change of plan. This year I'm not teaching methodology. I feel relieved about that. Someone else would do that. And I'm not in an easy position either, because this is clearly not my field of study, but I will try to do my best and interpret the function of a discussant. There are basically two possibilities. One, you engage in a discussion with the speaker, which is always useful for future dialogue. And the second is to try to open the door for a discussion with the audience. So with the PhDs, which I hope we'll have time to do, I will try to do both. I mean, the first option is very difficult because I generally tend to agree and take what Professor Cotten says as really authoritative. So I will try to play the devil's advocate. That's the first thing. Just a few remarks. And second, I will move to something broader, my personal understanding of transformations, and give you a few hints just to open the discussion on other possible venues concerning that topic. So first, the devil's advocate. When you read, what I did is to focus on one aspect of this, I would call it substantive transformation concerning the substance of the rule and the possible development. And I focus on the ISIL cases. I did exactly what he suggested. Read the letters that are sent to the Security Council. This is always the best thing. Go to the source and read what the states have to say, what they feel under the pressure of the situation they have to give explanations. And what do? They invoke basically, so ISIS to 2014, 2016, basically, a number of letters. You have Belgium, you have France, you have the United States, you have the last one, Turkey. Very interesting, the Turkey one. So what is my point? My point is that you can basically do two things. You pick every action and you evaluate the specific situation and you try to examine in the light of the existing rules, is it in conformity or not? Is it different? Do we have to justify? Do we have to accept the transformation or not? Or, and this is where the hard part lies, you try to take those into account as a whole. And this, I guess, is more difficult because in the end, they all invoke Article 51, basically collective self-defense. They all say that they can react against terrorists. So when you adopt this broader approach, possibly the discussion is more difficult because, yes, they invoke different reasons, but they're all tracked back to the notion of self-defense. So to what extent this practice, opinions of states, can we evaluate as a whole? This is basically my question. And would the answer be different if we proceed in the first way? We tackle each one individually, or we take that into account as a whole. Second points of discussion, that would be obviously a little longer. Now, what I've identified as transformations are possibly different kinds on different levels. So this is, let's say, the first one, the substantive one. Substantive means that we're looking at the rule and we try to establish if elements of practice, judicial decisions, and so on would imply a certain development. Second element, and I would not deal with that, it's the methodological level. It will be possibly discussed later on today or during the debate with us. It could be a positivist approach, a realist approach. If you take the typical realist approach, they would tell you what you have to look is reality. They have intervened, there must be a justification. So they simply reverse the analysis. They don't start from the rule, they start from the facts and so on. But second level, methodology. Third level, the normative transformation. And this is a very important aspect because it may ring a bell to all of you. It's the source's perspective, in a sense, is do we have to say that the rules are developed, they crystallize, they exist in a different way when we speak of the use of force? What is the value of precedent? What is the value of practice? What is the value of the violation of a breach? Professor Cotten was mentioning the court, Nicaragua case. It's the famous paragraph. I never remember if it's 103 or 106, but one of those where the court justifies its approach to the violations and not treating them as a preclusion for the recognition of the rule, but possibly the other way around if they can be included in an exception. So this is a completely different approach to the analysis that can be justified. The use of force or prohibition on the use of force is a special rule. It's a negative rule. You don't have much practice, at least in principle, because it's a negative rule. You're expected not to use force and not the other way around. So to confirm the existence of your rule, you in principle rely on silence, non-action, and so on. So this is possibly something that could be of interest to some of your research. Third, I've lost the count, 1, 2, 3, 4, the institutional approach or the institutional transformation. This is something that was possibly more discussed in the past. Today it's rather accepted that something, for example, like an authorization of the Security Council is possible. It was discussed. By institutional transformation, I mean the logic of centralization and decentralization, whether you need an institutional system, where hypotheses 2 and 3, threats to use force and genuine use of force, we have to wait for the Security Council. But do we have to wait for someone adopting a measure, a centralized measure, or we accept a redelegation to someone else? To what extent this is possible, to what extent the institutional intervention is needed, and to what extent the intervention, unilateral intervention of states. So the tension would rather be between individual and centralized intervention. The last, fifth transformation, what I could call procedural transformation. Now, it's a mixture of elements, but what I would refer to by speaking of procedural transformation is the need to have at least an assessment, a centralized assessment, when the breach of certain fundamental obligations for the protection of community interests are at stake. So it goes to the structure of certain legal obligations and the fact that when they protect a common value, individual or subjective action is problematic and remains problematic. Subjective appreciation, the letter sent that we are justified with this or that reason is no longer sufficient. What you need, or what we can say we need, is an objective determination, an objective establishment that the common good, that the common rule, that the rule for the protection of the common value has been breached. Now, so I refer basically to things, political procedures, so procedures before political bodies. We do have an example, and this brings me back to the Russian crisis, Ukrainian crisis, invasion, aggression, if you want. It's the determination by the General Assembly that an act of aggression has actually taken place. The very first resolution adopted in the emergency special session number 11 is a resolution where the General Assembly says aggression has taken place. It is a universal condemnation, 140, I don't remember, states agreeing, so the very, very broad majority of the international community. You may think that, well, we do have an assessment. So we don't have a central organ that may react, but at least we all agree that aggression has taken place. And unfortunately, when you read the reactions to other later resolutions adopted in that same emergency special session by states, especially China, and that was, at least for me, really astonishing. You read China saying, well, the General Assembly is not a judicial body. We can't take that as a judicial establishment. The General Assembly can't take itself for the International Court of Justice. Okay, all this to say what? Basically that I would make a step further and say we really do need a judicial establishment, ideally. I'm not saying that is realistic or politically acceptable. But to silence China or the opposition, the General Assembly is fine, but it's possibly not enough. So when you have breaches of jus cogens, of erga omnes obligations, and so on, it's hard to envisage an institutional mechanism, procedure of reaction, but at least an establishment would be extremely important to add an element of objectivity and avoid the sometimes exotic definitions or establishments that are carried out unilaterally by states. And possibly the ICJ, some other judicial body, I don't know. I would just finish on another example. The case before the ICJ, Ukraine versus Russia. I'm not going into the details. You know that the case is before the court, and that 32 declarations of intervention have been submitted before the court. A large number of those declarations insist on the fact that the commission of genocide, this time genocide, another possible erga omnes candidate or jus cogens candidate, cannot be established on a purely subjective basis. When you read the declarations of state, what is extremely interesting is to say that their main argument is we cannot accept the subjective, individual, unilateral statement of Russia saying that genocide was about to be committed, was committed in Ukraine. And what they insist is on the fact that something more objective, something more centralized must be carried out. And this process of intervention is one such tool for obtaining a more centralized determination. Okay, so this is just a few hints, a few elements to point out the different other possible transformations that may arise in connection with this topic. Thank you. Shall we have first, I don't know, Professor Contain reaction, or how shall we proceed? I'm looking at Pasquale.
As you prefer.
As you prefer.
I think that probably it's better Professor Contain.
Okay, fine.
If it's possible, quickly.
Okay.
In order to
Fine, fine. Thank you very much. I must say that I agree with you, particularly about this tension between perhaps two very opposite approaches. The first one would be realism. But in my view, if you take it seriously, you must come back to some statements like those made by Michael Glennon, who considered, for example, that there is no violation of international law when, for example, the US invaded Iraq, because there is no international law prohibiting the use of force. Why? Because in a realistic perspective, well, practice reveals that the states, if they decide to do it, they will intervene militarily without being limited by international law at all. But then, in the end, I mean, there is no legal argument justifying the intervention. The only justification would be the reality or the necessity, but politically and with a political dimension, not a legal dimension. It's the first perspective. According to me, very respectable, why not? But it's not so convincing, because if it was the case, I mean, if states weren't limited at all by international law, why would they justify their actions with proper legal arguments? What would they hire and pay legal advisors to find some arguments to justify the war, even when it is very difficult. For example, in the Iraqi war, the administration avoided to use the preventive war argument, legally speaking, but prefer to interpret broadly, but to base the intervention on existing Security Council resolutions. Why would they do that if they wouldn't be limited at all by international law? But still, it's the first possibility. The opposite position is the institutional perspective, according to which it would be required to obtain some kind of objective determination by either a political organ or preferably a legal organ. And of course, this time you must wait until you have some kind of objective determination. And in my view, well, it's partially the case in positive international law, because if you take levels 2 and 3, well, it is the case. You must have some kind of objective determination by the Security Council. Of course, the General Assembly, when it qualified something as an act of aggression, for me, it's something that could be taken into consideration, particularly because the General Assembly act here in the name, if we can say, of the Security Council, because the Security Council is paralyzed, so that it could be argued that it is sufficient to perhaps not to authorize a war, but to recognize a situation and therefore to legitimize an act of military riposte. After having read the debates between states inside the UN in relation to the Ukrainian war, it is true that some states like China were reluctant to objectively qualify the operation like an act of aggression. On the other hand, as far as I know, legally speaking, even the states that voted against 5 states or that did not vote in favor of the resolutions didn't follow Russia with their legal arguments, except Syria. But all the other states prefer to say, for example, we don't vote in favor of the resolution because it's not appropriate, because the Iraqi war was not condemned like that, so we won't follow Western states with the some kind of discrimination, arbitrary distinction between cases. But the institutional dimension, of course, can be to some extent applied to the reality. In an ideal world, of course, the ICJ could be seized also to determine if an action is legal or not. Of course, but many states don't want the court to judge their military actions. If you compare this case to the Kosovo War, for example, in both cases, or even a fortiori the Iraqi War, all the intervening states avoided to recognize any possibility for the court to make statements. Still, the court, with the interim measures procedure, chose even indirectly to condemn the war in Yugoslavia and in Ukraine. But of course, it's not a proper judicial assessment or condemnation. And between those two options, we have a wide range of possibilities. And of course, but I will be brief, so I will perhaps come back to that later. If we want to analyze, for example, the war against ISIL in the past years, we have different interpretations, of course, of this kind of practice. But my point is perhaps just to say that the transformation of war is not so obvious in the sense that this kind of situation to repose to acts posed by irregular forces, for example, is not new at all. I mean, during the Russian Civil War, after the revolution, it was at that time one problem, and it is why it was discussed inside the League of Nations, the use of irregular forces by states. But at the time, the Soviet Union accused Western states to support white Russians in the Civil War, but I mean, just it's not new, this situation, and this is why the texts that existed have already taken those situations into consideration. We could change the text. We can also consider that the texts are not should be interpreted differently, but in my view, we should, in that case, show that there is an agreement by the international community as a whole, and it is doubtful, in my view, if we look, for example, at the war against ISIL, that it could be established, particularly with some condemnations, including by the military actions launched by Turkey, for example, in Iraq and Syria. So I don't know at this stage if we can.
I think we should gather questions from the audience.
Questions or observations?
Yes. Yes, great. I think you should use the mic. And please state your name before. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. My name is Marta Strapa. I'm a PhD candidate with Santana School of Advanced Studies, and I will present my thesis in these days. I'm working on the use of new technologies, especially autonomous cyber capabilities in the use of force and conduct of hostilities, and I found a lot of similarities in the way these new technologies may transform war, not only in the conduct of hostilities, but also in the assessment of the different thresholds of use of force or intervention. And I wanted to ask you your opinion in respect to the use of potential use of these technologies also to respond to possible, for instance, cyber operations or any kind of potential attack that has not been assessed by humans, but only by computer or a machine. How will this change? Will this arise new challenges? I guess yes, and yeah, that's thank you very much.
Okay, so I respond now, and then, okay. Thanks. In my view, it's not so difficult. Of course, it can be difficult on a case-by-case basis to assess the legality of a use of a cyber attack and about a possible riposte after such an attack. But the general approach is not so difficult. I mean, the use of force is not defined in the text, so it could cover many possibilities, including non-conventional force. It's not new. For example, the use of chemical weapons or biological weapons, or even if you take the 9/11 attacks, and they were considered as attacks by the Security Council in its resolution 1368. Well, in all those cases, non-conventional means were considered as equivalent to a use of force because the effects were similar to a use of force. And the effects, it's not only damages caused or victims caused, because otherwise you could do that, but this, if you do that if you limit this to the objective determination of effects, you could also say that an embargo, for example, would be equivalent to use of force because it causes many deaths, casualties, damages, like the Iraqi situation in the 90s can illustrate. and it was not recognized as a use of force. So the effect theory is, on the one hand, refers to the number of victims and casualties and damages, but on the other, refers to a direct causation. And of course, it could be tricky to determine that on a case-by-case basis, but of course, if a cyber attack causes immediately an explosion, for example, if you target a nuclear plant, well, of course, it would be an armed attack. But it could be difficult. I must say that, as far as I know, states basically agree about that general methodology. But some debates take place, as usual, when you turn to a specific operation. Perhaps a last remark about that. Of course, we must distinguish cyber operations conducted in a context of war. Like, for example, now in Ukraine, certain operations are conventional, others are conducted by cyber means. In this case, of course, we have a general situation, and you can repose, but it's not easy to determine if you repose only to the cyber dimension of the attack or to the attack as a whole. So you have a wide range of possibilities. But the real problem is if you have a situation of peace, and like, for example, Iran recently, or Lithuania in a certain time ago, where the victims or many other states actually, or the US during the elections, for example, where the target of certain military operations. This time it's more difficult, and this methodology with effects caused directly by the operation that would be equivalent to a use of force is, in my view, very appropriate.
Thank you. I'm Davide Vaira. I'm a PhD student at the University of Foggia, and my thesis is also about cybersecurity. So my question is most about the fact that cyber attacks now are conducted most of the time by privates or private companies that are not linked or apparently not linked to states. Sometimes they conduct cyber attacks without the authorization of their state or against their state considerations. And there is a problem of about the fact that when a cyber attack is conducted, most of the time, the damages are direct, immediate. So there is no time to defend by the country that is victim of the cyber attack. So my question is there a danger of a sort of escalation, a sort of new type of Cold War, cyber Cold War, because the countries know that they cannot defend if a cyber attack is launched, and they are not preventive cyber defense, and in which way this can affect also the stability of attacks and defense from a perspective of international law and of also the conduction of war balances and dialogues between the countries.
Okay, thanks. The problem of the actions launched by private actors is not limited to cyber attacks, of course, but you are right, is very well illustrated in this domain. Perhaps two things, legally speaking. First, it is true that it is difficult to attribute actions made by private actors to states. particularly if they act independently of those states, but even if they act with some complicity of the state concerned. Of course, once again, it's a case-by-case problem, but it's difficult, so it could be a problem. On the other hand, there is no prohibition to target a private actor, I mean, including military speaking. It's a matter of human rights, it's a matter of criminal law, and possibly of cooperation between states against private actors. But the point is, and it can be extended, for example, to the question of ISIL, for example, beyond this cyber dimension. There is no need to invoke, for example, self-defense against a non-state actor, because there is no prohibition to use force against a non-state actor. I mean, in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. So you are not obliged to invoke an exception if the rule doesn't prohibit your action. In other words, you can target private actors. You can try, of course, to stop their actions. You can try to arrest them, and even possibly to target them by violence if you won't violate Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. You won't violate the prohibition to use force. So there is no need to invoke self-defense. Of course, on the one hand, you must respect human rights or the law of armed conflict if you are in the context of a non-international armed conflict. But you won't violate Article 2.4. It's not a question of jus contra bellum. It's not a problem of non-use of force. First point. But second point, if you want to target this non-state actor on the territory of another state, well, in this case, you will be obliged to invoke an argument, because you cannot just say, like some states did, that, well, I don't attack the state even if I bomb the territory of this state, I kill civilians of this state, civilians perhaps not, but nationals of this state, and I destroy buildings and goods of these states, like it was the case during the attacks in Syria against ISIL. The idea that it won't be equivalent to a use of force against Syria in this case is not convincing at all, because if you look at the text, of course, if you cross the boundary with a military aircraft, and if you bomb the territory of a state, it's the more classical example of an armed attack against a state. It's in the definition of aggression. So why not? You could do that, but you must this time have a proper justification, not only against the non-state actor, it's not very relevant in my view, but against the state. It's not impossible, but you must have a reflection about that. This is why, for example, the theory of unwilling or unable has been conceived. And it's more logical, in my view, than to argue that you don't attack the state at all. But this time, if you have this theory of unwilling or unable, it will be difficult because all the text and the case law are against this theory, but I don't have the time perhaps to develop. In my view, it's the case. But to sum up, the advantage when you have this kind of situation with private actor using means possibly equivalent to a use of force is that you are not in the domain of the non-use of force in international law, in international relations. In other words, you are not under the umbrella of Article 2.4, so you are not obliged to invoke self-defense as an argument to target those non-state actors. That won't respond to all the problems you could have, but at least it's something important to keep in mind.
Okay, if you don't mind me to step in just to add something. You mentioned the unwilling and unable theory. For me, the most difficult part has always been to frame let's say the complicity of the state to make it easier. So where would you put complicity of the state in the 4 categories? Is it possible to amount to the 4th, to the armed attack justifying self-defense, or are we always in the 2nd and the 3rd? Because when you have terrorists, for example, obviously the state is not directly the author of the attack, but may have assisted, contributed, so that's why I'm referring to complicity, instead of unwilling and unable. Complicity means that there is an actual contribution.
Mm-hmm. In my view, if you look at the existing case law, not only Nicaragua, but also DRC against Uganda in 2005, the state of the law is not so ambiguous, because at level 4, you have a possibility to apply the theory of complicity if you show that the action is equivalent either to sending a private group abroad or an irregular group abroad, or to be substantially involved in the activities of the group. And those are the words taken from Article 3G of the definition of aggression, quoted by the court as reflecting customary international law and reproduced, for example, in 2010 in the statute of the International Criminal Court. Here we have, of course, it's a high level. You have a very close relationship between the state and the non-state actor, like possibly it was the case in Afghanistan in 2001. But the problem is that the United States didn't invoke this proper legal argument, but preferred to say, okay, any support is equivalent to an armed attack and therefore can trigger a right to self-defense. And this time, it's not in conformity with existing international law, either Article 3G or, of course, the law of international responsibility that distinguishes very clearly, on the one hand, attribution and direct control or total dependence with those possibilities, or aid or assistance. And this is the second part. This is complicity but traduced in interstate relations, because complicity is a criminal notion with some kind of idea of intention, which was not reproduced as such in the law of international responsibility. The simple facts of knowing what happens and doing nothing to prevent it, or even to support the actions without being substantially involved in those actions, is sufficient to establish an aid or assistance. And in my view, it's equivalent to level 3 or 2, depending on if the actions are equivalent to a force or a threat, aid or assistance. So the act as such is not attributed to the state, but another act is attributed. The act is to support or even to do nothing to prevent an action. But this time, to show that, you should show it's not sufficient to say that the actions were made from the territory of the state. You must show that the state knew those actions took place on the one hand and did nothing that it could do. It's an obligation of means to prevent them. It was very clear in DRC against Uganda. The court proceeded like this. On the one hand, considering that the DRC didn't send Ugandan rebels to attack Uganda, so no self-defense, and in another part of the judgment, considered that there was no violation of international law at all, so no level 2 or 3, because it was true that some Ugandan rebels were present in Congolese territory, but it was not established that Congo knew that and was able, and here an able or a willing is very efficient, but not to be used to characterize an armed attack, but rather a complicity or a violation of the use of force in level 3. It's my view, it is a state of the law. Of course, in practice, many states invoked the theory beyond that, even suppressing the unwillingness of the state in the Syrian case, because Syria was combating ISIL, actually. But in my view, it was not unanimously or even accepted by the international community as a whole, considering the different reactions that were observed in this precedent by Russia, China, but also by many other states, actually.
Yes, 1 and 2, ladies first.
Thank you very much. I hope it's fine. My voice is really low, so sorry for that. Thank you again for the insightful presentation. I'm dealing with interstate complaints in the field of human rights law, so my question is kind of related to the topic.
And your name is?
Veronica Botticelli. And I was wondering, you mentioned many different non-armed instruments in this hybrid war concept. And I was wondering what is, in your opinion, the current role of lawfare in this context? Because we have plenty of international proceedings. I would say it's kind of a new thing, maybe concerning the Ukraine-Russia war. And I was wondering if they can be conceived as tools for law-abiding nations to try to contrast the abuse of concept of law by Russia in this case. And in relation to this, can we say that this misuse, abuse of law proceedings, whatever we want to call them or label them, it's like contributing to blurring, further blurring the distinction between legal and political plans of the discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, according to the creators of this notion of hybrid war, all the different new methods of warfare could cover lawfare, so the use of law. Sorry for the confusion. Why? Because on the one hand, those different thresholds would be used to avoid a military riposte. So the means used would be just below the threshold in order to avoid the possibilities of riposte. And on the other hand, on a more procedural perspective, the state, basically Russia, would avoid to recognize the jurisdiction of International Court of Tribunals, or would stop any cooperation with them, like with the Council of Europe. Well, two remarks perhaps. One, it's not new. If you take Nicaragua, for example, it's the same thing. The US avoided to send troops like they did, for example, in the past in some Latin American countries. They avoided to send private actors, like in Cuba in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs of operation. So they used means what they wanted to, well, they hoped that it was just below the threshold. Financing, using secret services, using the economic weapon, and so forth. It's not new. And on a procedural perspective, they stopped all cooperation with the ICJ and considered that the decision made by the ICJ was not legally founded because the ICJ had no jurisdiction. So it's the same thing nowadays with Russia. And we could, of course, say the same thing on a procedural perspective if we look at, for example, the Iraqi war. So first thing, it's not new. And secondly, in my view, the risk to use the use of law, to criticize the use of law as a warfare, as a method of warfare, would be that here again, that could justify some kind of military riposte. When, for example, you are a specialist in the domain of human rights, of course, when you consider that the fact for migrants to ask for asylum is an act of war, is an attack, of course, you could justify, on the one hand, a riposte by military means, but also, of course, you will justify some kind of derogation in the domain of human rights with a state of emergency proclaimed in Poland for the first time since 1981 during this crisis, and possibly to justify different measures, possibly infringing human rights in the name of a state of war. So this martial terminology is dangerous in the domain of human rights too, in my view. In my view, to briefly said, to use legal means to try, for example, to avoid to reach a threshold is a good thing. It's not a problem. It's not to abuse law. It's, of course, a strategy, but, of course, states, and it's normal, and it's fortunate, have a strategy to avoid, to trigger some legal threshold and consequently some report that could follow, and also to use the legal possibilities to accept or refuse the jurisdiction of an international court. It has been designated in the past like the use of peaceful means, of course, perhaps not very, we can as international lawyer not be very seduced by it, and if we take this requirement of objective or ideal of objective determination, it's not a good thing, but it's legal. It's legal to use legal means to reach your objective. And to confuse it with war is dangerous, according to me.
Thank you for your relation, for your both relation. I am Marco Pasqua, a PhD student at the Catholic University of Milan. I'm used to deal with private international law, so I'm quite out of my comfort zone here, but there are a lot of points of contact, I would say. And I am quite curious about this traditional partition between first non-military weapons, then military weapons. So non-military weapons as preliminary to military weapons. I am quite provocative, I would be clear, but I'm not totally sure about this. Because let's see the deviation to Russian aggression, so the massive international sanctions adopted at every level. Restriction measured by states, by international organizations that should be neutral because of their status, and they adopted restriction measure. So I'm not totally sure, because if I would like to get a state to bankruptcy, to a failure, I can make it by economic sanction, not by simple military attack. So I'm not totally sure about this point. And if you are talking about transformation, I think that this is a transformation now. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps 2 points. First, military or non-military weapons are not, in my view, the appropriate expressions, because as we talked about this a few minutes ago, you can use non-conventional means to use force. For example, biological weapon, or like it was the case in the 9/11 events, well, the terrorists didn't use weapons, but the effects were equivalent to a use of force. So what matters is not the weapon, but the effect and the characterization of the action as a whole that could be equivalent to a use of force, even without using weapons. This is why, for example, I spoke about the economic weapon. Many states refuse to recognize it as a use of force, perhaps because of the distinction between direct causation and indirect causation. But perhaps we must not exclude that in some cases, if economic measures provoke direct damages in an hospital, or I don't know, it could be equivalent to a use of force. I wouldn't exclude that entirely, completely. So the weapon is not the problem. The problem is to determine if your action is equivalent to a use of force. And the second remark, it's of course interesting in this case. In my view, the states that support Ukraine, they adopted economic sanctions, they sent arms, they possibly sent some instructors, but they avoided to say that they were involved, that they were co-belligerents in the war, as if they couldn't do that. In my view, they could do that. They could send weapons, planes, military personnel. They could bomb Russian soldiers, even in Russia, because, of course, if we assess the situation with only a legal perspective, we are in a situation of collective self-defense, but obviously another situation that the one that was presented by Russia. The republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are not states in international law. Therefore, the Russian action is an act of aggression, like the General Assembly determined. And therefore, Ukraine is in a situation of self-defense. And the other states can support Ukraine by using the argument of collective self-defense. So here, Western states do less than they could do, legally speaking, for obvious political reasons. I'm not here contending that they should bomb Moscow, of course, because law only provides you some tools, some possible means, but does not determine what is the objective. And of course, it's for the political assessment, which is perhaps more important than law, to determine if you want to intervene militarily. It is not because you have a legal justification that it is appropriate to intervene. And some precedent in the past could illustrate that. For example, perhaps the French intervention in Rwanda in 1994, it was legally founded, but perhaps it was not a very positive action in terms of effects. But basically said, here we have economic sanctions, but military sanctions could be employed too. So in my view, it's not a problem, legally speaking, for Western states to sanction Russia, obviously, legally speaking.
So thank you. So thank you again also from my side. My name is Gabriele Redigonda, PhD candidate at the University of Florence. And I'm dealing with space law. So it's a bit somehow touching the topic, right? So, and I mean that there have been some developments in the space domain, which was somehow identified also by NATO as one of the domains, warfare domains, some years ago. And there are these space corps somehow being established across the world, in the US, then in France and so on, and also in Italy right now. So my question is, what about war in space? What kind of complexity from a very legal perspective does it add to this reflection on hybrid warfare? Can it be fully, let's say, integrating the reflection on cyber attacks and so on, as it is another warfare domain? Or does it add new challenges to the reflection in that sense? It just really somehow to provoke the reflection and to trigger some reaction from your side. But I think that's a reflection that's not sufficiently ongoing at this stage, maybe because of the Outer Space Treaty, which is somehow preventing it, but I think we are almost there. So the question is, what new legal challenges would it add to the reflection, at least in your view?
Thank you. I'm not specialized in space law, but I would say two things. First, well, perhaps three things. First and foremost, of course, the rules prohibiting the use of force and the exceptions to those rules are applicable also in space. So you cannot just say that there is this no-law zone, of course. Secondly, it could have some effect, and because I think about this theory of interceptive self-defense, which was conceived, if I'm correct, by Joram Dimstein in his book about self-defense. The idea is that you can answer to the questions at the basis and the preoccupations at the basis of the theory of preventive self-defense. And the preoccupation is that, of course, you cannot wait until being the victim of a nuclear armed attack before riposting, otherwise you couldn't do that. So the element of necessity would found a preventive riposte, and the answer made by Joram Dimstein is convincing, according to me. It is that no, because the texts are very clear, and some discussions took place inside the UN about that, and it was refused. But one thing is to say that you cannot react preventively. Another thing is to say that you can riposte to an attack that has occurred. This is a word taken from Article 51. So if the attack has begun, and there is no clear determination of the moment in which the attack has begun, but what is sure is that if you launch a missile, for example, and the victim state target the missile before the missile reaches its aerial space, well, it could be considered as self-defense in the classical meaning of the term, an interceptive self-defense, because you intercept the weapon before it reaches your territory. And it could be, of course, be in the space, but also even on the territory of the attacking state. Even perhaps before the missile would be launched, if you show that the decision has been taken. It's very theoretical, because I don't know any precedent in which that could be verified, but at least in theory it could be argued. So you could use space as a way to avoid being damaged by an attack. Another illustration could be, but I'm not specialist, you will answer me, but if a private actor would use space to launch an attack, well, of course, as I've said, there is no prohibition to use force against a non-state actor. And if you target a non-state actor in the space, of course a very powerful non-state actor, you wouldn't violate Article 2.4 because you wouldn't reach the territory of another state. In other words, you wouldn't attack another state, but only a non-state actor. So perhaps those are some elements of reflection about space law.
Good morning again. Just an observation on a methodological issue, I think. The way you approached your keynote speech on transformation of war, it seems to me at least, that you are adopting an approach that says we have always classic, so to say, traditional international law to be applied, even to new issues, because I've heard questions from many of the PhD students about so-called technological issues, and cyber war and the space law and so on. And I think that you adopted an approach that says we have rules, we just have to apply them, to adopt them to new situations. Not only, we do not need necessarily new rules. And this reminded me, and I think that's what I think too. And this reminded me an approach of some scholars that accused those who say this to be interventionists. We do have an interventionist approach. Why? Because we are trying to justify our self-work, our job, our role in the world as international lawyers. No? I'm thinking to a friend of ours, Mr. Aspremont, that wrote about this, some pieces. So, just this question, just to know, what is your position about this criticism about the so-called interventionist approach? It is to say, we have rules, we have international law, we can apply international law even to so-called technological issues, and we do not need necessarily to write new rules about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course, it's true. I mean, but it's more general. If you take a more sociological perspective, using, for example, Bourdieu's works, you will, of course, assess this kind of situation as a battlefield between lawyers or between specialists of war, and obviously international lawyers most of the time. I have evoked an exception with Michael Glennon, for example, considering that there is no international law at all. But most of the time, international lawyers will say that international law does exist, that some theories like global law are not very efficient and blurred categories and possibly are dangerous.
The joke, international law is here to stay, no?
Yes. And, but I'm specialist of international law, so I'm the appropriate expert to assess the situation. Well, we must have a reflexive reflection about our work. Of course, it's true. It's also a battle in the academic field. It is true. But I get that if you have chosen to study and to make international law, it is also, perhaps for also strategic, with a strategic agenda, but possibly that you think that perhaps international law is perhaps a way to regulate international relations that is not perfect, but perhaps preferable than other ways to regulate international law. But it's a tension between, of course, realism. It's my interest to show that. It's my interest here to be the supporter of classical international law because I make and I studied classical international law. But on the other hand, if you want to be efficient and to be convincing, you must, in the first place, to be convinced yourself that what you do is not only for your own interest. This would be my answer.
The president. But you have to wait for the mic.
Even
My name is Pasquale Desini.
University.
Of Palermo.
Thank you.
Currently. So, there's no doubt that the Russian aggression has been an aggression. But I would like to point out the high threshold, the high political threshold of this war. And that comes out at least from three circumstances. The first one, the fact that you have rightly pointed out that legal argumentations are very uncertain, so to say. The second one, the very political nature of the objections raised by a lot of states, not a few states in General Assembly. And thirdly, the contradiction between the fact that Russia has triggered the war, but both Russia and China maintain that the ban of war exists. So what is at stake is, in my opinion, a very strong opposition to the Western hegemony as a rule. That is a political aspect, it's not a legal one. What does it mean? Or better, what could it mean? I think that such a stance could even produce legal changes. We don't know. We can't know what is going to happen because the war is currently developing, unfortunately. And maybe it could occur that some changes, some legal changes, could also be constitutional changes. We don't know what we are going to see. Don't you think that in such a perspective, that is from the point of view of the political threshold of this war, that in my opinion makes this war more similar to the Second World War than to the Iraqi war. If we look at the Second World War after the end of the war, what we can see, a lot of legal changes. Well, we don't know what is going to happen from this point of view, but it could happen that this war produced legal changes. And don't you think that in such a perspective, we have to suspend, so to say, our stance, also our legal stance? I don't want to discuss the fact that this war is an aggression from the point of view of the law currently in force. There's no doubt about this, but I don't know. I don't think, that this war is going to change the ban of war. It seems to me that it's not probable that this is going to occur, but it could occur also this. And so I think that it is probably better, I don't know, to define this war as an anti-systemic war. Not a hybrid war. I agree with you, but there is something undeniable, that is the incredible high threshold, political threshold of this war, that in my opinion, is something that differs from what occurred in the case of the Iraqi war and others. Don't you think so?
Thank you. Well, as you've said, one thing interesting is that Russia invoked not only law, but classical argument, the existence of a state, self-defense. They avoided to use new kinds of arguments, at least if we interpret, in my view, strictly the argument advanced by Russia in the letter sent to the Security Council. So it's interesting because if you compare this with the Trump administration in the USA, when the USA intervened militarily, particularly in Syria, for example, against the Syrian regime in 2017 and 2018, the USA didn't really advance a legal argument. In my view, they evoked justifications, but more moral or political than genuinely legal. Israel, for example, it's very interesting because nowadays when they intervened in Syria, in Lebanon, for example, they don't really develop a legal argument like they did in the past. And here but it was limited to a very reduced number of countries. Most of the countries in the world, like Russia, still invoke a legal argument. And it's not new, it's not obvious that they want to change the rules. Of course, they like to interpret them in their interest, like it was in the past, once again. But if we have a new conference like in 2005, after 60 years of the creation of the Charter, 20 years later, I don't know, in 2025, it's not obvious that, for me that new rules would emerge. But
for me as well.
Okay, so just to be clear. But
this high threshold of objection to the Western hegemony, we don't find it, nor in the case of Iraqi war, that was, on the contrary, a defense of the political, international political order in a certain sense. Neither in the case of the Israeli war that you mentioned, that you have both mentioned. In this case, we find this, for instance, in the statement, in the joint statement of 24 February 2022, made by China and Russia, the 4th February, not 24. Mm-hmm. And also in the statement delivered by Putin following the meeting with Xi Jinping. And also in some unilateral declarations delivered by Xi Jinping. And we don't find something similar. I'm saying, well understood, at the political level.
Well, if you look at the Iraqi war, you will find many statesmen supporting international law, supporting the UN.
International law.
Yeah, but here it's once again Russia and China contend that they support international law.
But also supporting there. In other words, there was no contestation, no objection to the political general equilibrium of the international order. In this case, we are in face of something like that.
Yes, okay. Well, it could be discussed because the Bush administration at some point was tempted to challenge the UN. And of course, it was a challenge to the international political and legal order. But still, there is a problem, in my view, on the political level. You are right. But this problem is not about Ukraine only, but it's perhaps about many, what it is called frozen conflicts, like in Cyprus, like in Chechnya, like in Karabakh, like in Georgia, like even in Kosovo. And perhaps you spoke about history and certain change of the political order, if not the legal order. Here we could imagine a conference with certain discussion about the statute of certain territories and possibly changing the boundaries. Because, and of course it's not, you can not say that no, because it would be interpreted as a support to Russia. But in my view, it is true that there is a problem, because after 1999, at least, many regions in the world and in Europe, basically, are not really, the situation is not pacified. The application of orthodox international law, refusal to self-determination of a right to secession, maintenance of the boundaries as they are, in the name of the defense of peace and security. Well, after 30 years, more than 30 years, it seemed that perhaps it's not so easy, and perhaps we could imagine a conference with a discussion about Crimea, about Karabakh, about Transnistria. In my view, it would be appropriate, perhaps not now, but at some stage, and it's not a question of international law, but rather of a new political European order, and even, of course, Palestine, if we go beyond, or Western Sahara. We have very different situation in which the distinction between law and facts is so important that perhaps we could imagine a new balance of power, even within the existing rules, because sometimes some will say that it's not possible because you cannot change boundaries. Of course you can change boundaries if you have an agreement, but you can change boundaries. There is no such thing as a principle of intangibility of boundaries. Look at maps in history, you will see that it changes all the time.
Yes, boundaries is only one aspect. I would pose another question, if we have just 2 or 3 minutes. What do you think about the fact that the arrest warrant of Putin has been adopted in the context of the war?
It's a big question because it refers to the legitimacy of the ICC.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
We have a problem with the watch.
Okay. So we will talk about that in private.
Yes, I just mentioned 2 things for the PhDs. Just to remind them, 2 Italian fathers of international law that had different approaches to this. One is Conforti, no law with the eruption of war, so sort of suspension. I don't know if you mentioned that, but there are situations in which the law no longer applies or international law. Okay, but there is one. The other one is Morelli.
I was referring to Quadri.
Okay, so I would add Morelli that says that, or said that the war can be used to change the law. And that was one of the possibilities to change the law. But you were referring to political situation, not to the law itself.
I would also specify that
Maybe,
legal
yes.
changes may be
Exactly.
used. In that case, Morelli was right.
Who knows?
Who spoke in another methodological perspective of war revolution, anti-systemic.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
Allora, bentrovate, bentrovati. fungo io insomma un po' da coordinatore, diciamo razione materia, diciamo così, però permettetemi di ringraziare Pepe, il Centro Studi Gentiliani e la SIDI per l'invito. Mi fa molto piacere essere tornato qui dopo esserci stato per qualche anno prima di Giovanni con le stesse funzioni. Allora, le regole del gioco direi che potrebbero essere queste, cioè le presentazioni da parte di Giulia Grati e di Federica Velli potrebbero avere una durata di massimo 20 minuti, quindi anche un quarto d'ora va bene, però insomma massimo 20 minuti, dopodiché apriamo un po' la discussione, insomma, magari partiamo noi con qualche considerazione e poi sentiamo anche colleghi e dottorande e dottorandi. Allora, Giulia Agrati presenta la sua tesi di dottorato che è relativa al controllo giurisdizionale delle misure di applicazione del diritto dell'Unione Europea. A lei la parola.
Buongiorno a tutti e ringrazio l'organizzazione, la SIDI, per appunto questa occasione di discussione e di confronto. Il tema della mia tesi di ricerca è appunto quello del controllo giurisdizionale delle misure di esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea e sostanzialmente prende le mosse dall'attuale panorama di esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea che, come dire, nel corso del tempo si è andato a evolvere, in un certo senso a modificare da quello che vediamo invece codificato all'interno dei trattati all'articolo 4, all'articolo poi 291 del TUE e del TFUE. Come dire, a partire da questo nuovo assetto di cui poi cercherò appunto di illustrarvi qualcosa circa l'esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea, la mia ricerca si propone di come dire, mettere alla prova il sistema di tutela giurisdizionale così come delineato dai trattati, proprio metterlo alla prova di questa sempre più crescente commistione tra livelli di amministrazione nazionale e comunitaria, allo scopo di sondare se a fronte di un mutamento nel sistema di esecuzione il principio di tutela giurisdizionale effettiva, di completezza dei rimedi giurisdizionali tiene ancora o se forse anch'esso, anche il sistema di tutela giurisdizionale necessita di alcune modifiche proprio per come dire, far fronte appunto al nuovo sistema esecutivo. Sostanzialmente appunto i trattati delineano un sistema dicotomico secondo cui l'esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea spetta agli Stati membri, in primis, che appunto hanno competenza generale circa l'attuazione e l'esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea, e soltanto in casi particolari, quando sono necessarie condizioni uniformi di esecuzione, l'amministrazione diventa diretta, quindi direttamente ad opera delle istituzioni dell'Unione Europea. Questo sistema così chiaro e rappresentato dai trattati in realtà ha visto una trasformazione nel corso del tempo, sia a seguito dell'emersione di nuovi soggetti istituzionali, dapprima i comitati, ma allo stato attuale ad esempio le agenzie dell'Unione Europea, le autorità indipendenti a livello nazionale, sia dall'altra parte a seguito dell'emersione di nuovi procedimenti proprio esecutivi che vedono un avvicendarsi di una fase nazionale e di una fase comunitaria. Ad esempio, per darvi un po' il quadro della complessità del sistema di esecuzione, un procedimento particolare che a me stessa aveva abbastanza stupito è quello di revoca della licenza bancaria, ad esempio, che sostanzialmente la BCE, istituzione dell'Unione Europea, ha competenza esclusiva a revocare la licenza bancaria, ma questa operazione di revoca può essere fatta in determinati casi, tra cui quando ci si ritrova davanti ad una situazione di fail or likely to fail, vuol dire quando la banca sostanzialmente presenta un rischio grave di fallimento che può essere anche dovuto ad una serie di violazioni del diritto dell'Unione Europea. Per quanto riguarda le banche, vi racconto questo esempio perché vengo dal Comitato Unico di Risoluzione ed è un esempio che ad esempio ho toccato con mano. Quando una banca, parliamo di banche less significant, quindi di quelle banche per cui la supervisione e la risoluzione rimangono in mano alle autorità nazionali e le istituzioni dell'Unione Europea hanno soltanto una funzione sostanzialmente di controllo e di supervisione. In questo caso il documento sul rischio di fallimento viene fatto dalle autorità nazionali che raccolgono dati e che stilano questo documento. Segue poi una revisione da parte di un'agenzia dell'Unione Europea, quindi del Single Resolution Board, ma alla fine colei che adotta effettivamente il provvedimento di revoca è l'istituzione dell'Unione Europea. Quindi siamo di fronte ad un procedimento veramente complesso in cui la misura è un provvedimento comunitario, ma che prende le mosse da una istruttoria, se così possiamo dire, che è completamente nazionale. E così come questo vi sono molti altri procedimenti appunto complessi in cui i due livelli di amministrazione vanno a fondersi fra loro e in cui appunto non è più ben chiara quale sia la matrice della misura. Questo porta anche appunto ad interrogarci sostanzialmente anche sul sistema delle fonti. A fianco a nuovi soggetti, nuovi procedimenti, ci troviamo dinanzi anche a nuove forme di esecuzione, in primis tra tutti ad esempio la soft law. La soft law viene utilizzata moltissimo a livello esecutivo in ambiti come diciamo fortemente regolamentati come quello finanziario, come quello del sistema bancario. Le ESA, che sono le autorità sostanzialmente che vigilano questo sistema, adottano molte guidelines che sono formalmente degli atti non vincolanti ma sostanzialmente vincolanti, si basano su un sistema sostanzialmente di naming and shaming, hanno differenti sanzioni che non sono quelle classiche ma che rendono in sostanza la misura coercibile. E anche da questo punto di vista come si pone il controllo giurisdizionale di fronte a queste nuove misure di esecuzione che sono sostanzialmente vincolanti ma che molto spesso è difficile portare davanti alla Corte giustiziaria. Di recente, in realtà ormai qualche anno fa, però appunto da ultimo c'è stato questo caso FBF della Corte di Giustizia che proprio si è interrogata sulla possibilità di sindacare una guidelines dell'ESA e si è concluso per, come dire, l'inammissibilità del ricorso per annullamento di fronte a questa misura, ma tutt'al più l'ammissibilità di un rinvio pregiudiziale. Quindi anche in questo caso vediamo che emergono delle nuove fonti di esecuzione che non sempre vedono una tutela effettiva per i privati che poi sono destinatari di queste misure di esecuzione. Quindi a partire da questo panorama complesso di coamministrazione, di interscambio fra più livelli amministrativi, la mia tesi vuole poi indagare nello specifico appunto il controllo giurisdizionale. Controllo giurisdizionale delle misure di esecuzione che quindi possono essere misure o totalmente dell'Unione Europea, quindi comunitarie, oppure misure nazionali che però vedono sempre una matrice ibrida, perché si è parlato molto di amministrazione in funzione comunitaria, cioè anche quando la misura è adottata formalmente, quindi proceduralmente dalle autorità nazionali, in realtà la matrice e la sostanza è una matrice comunitaria, quindi la misura è sempre una misura di tipo ibrido. E dal punto di vista appunto del controllo, la mia tesi va ad indagare sia i mezzi, quindi quali sono gli strumenti che il giudice nazionale e il giudice dell'Unione Europea hanno a disposizione per sindacare questo tipo di misure. Per quanto riguarda in particolare il giudice comunitario si parlerà appunto del rinvio pregiudiziale, del ricorso per annullamento anche a seguito diciamo, dell'ultima modifica apportata dal Trattato di Lisbona circa la possibilità di sindacare gli atti regolamentari con un diverso grado di come dire, con diversi requisiti rispetto agli atti non regolamentari, le procedure di infrazione, le eccezioni di inammissibilità. Sicuramente il focus sarà quello del rinvio pregiudiziale come ad oggi sostanzialmente unico strumento ponte che di fronte ad un'amministrazione sempre più intrecciata riesca a collegare i due livelli, nazionale e comunitario. anche se appunto la domanda rimane quella se è sufficiente il rinvio pregiudiziale o se è necessario un altro tipo di collaborazione. Su questo tema andrò ad indagare anche ad esempio la possibilità di una collaborazione stessa tra amministrazioni, anche nel momento in cui alla stessa amministrazione viene richiesto di disapplicare il diritto dell'Unione Europea, nel momento in cui non ha il rinvio pregiudiziale come strumento per poter interrogare l'istituzione comunitaria, si andrà a vedere se è possibile creare un dialogo anche fra amministrazioni stesse. E oltre appunto al tema dei mezzi si andrà a vedere anche l'intensità del controllo, sia dal punto di vista diciamo della legalità esterna, quindi per quanto riguarda la procedura, sia per quanto riguarda la legalità interna. E per quanto riguarda quest'ultimo punto, anche qui come dire, il controllo sarà un controllo diverso a seconda del tipo di misura che viene adottato e a seconda, come dire, di che cosa si considera per legalità interna, fin dove si può andare a considerare l'interesse nazionale nel momento in cui si tratta di una misura comunque di esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea e quindi nel momento in cui deve essere soppesato all'interesse nazionale ovviamente l'interesse dell'Unione Europea. Ora, allo stato attuale devo dire che non ho ancora delle conclusioni preliminari sul lavoro. Sicuramente è un lavoro molto ampio e da questo punto di vista sto cercando di restringere il campo di indagini perché appunto l'esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea coinvolge moltissimi ambiti, diciamo razione materie. Sicuramente mi sto concentrando sugli ambiti più fortemente regolamentati, quindi l'ambito finanziario, l'ambito bancario, l'ambito delle telecomunicazioni, però il lavoro si potrebbe estendere, diciamo, potrebbe diventare molto ampio razione materia e dunque il mio diciamo, lavoro di quest'ultimo periodo è quello, mi sto concentrando sul cercare di trovare una ratio che possa escludere alcuni ambiti e concentrarmi su altri ambiti. Direi che
Ottimo.
concluso.
Perfetto, grazie mille. Io ho dimenticato di dire la provenienza, Università di Milano, giusto? Mi scuso, non l'avevo detto prima, così come mi scuso con Giovanni Zara e Fulvio Palombino perché non li ho citati. Devo fare il mio mestiere, non l'ho fatto. Apriamo noi le danze, poi ovviamente c'è spazio per tutti. Allora, io intanto grazie per questa presentazione. Ho qualche commento generale che viene un po' dalla lettura dell'abstract e dalla sua ricostruzione. Il primo commento che condivido la sua considerazione sull'ampiezza del lavoro, cioè mi pare veramente una indagine forse troppo ampia, perché effettivamente se parliamo dell'esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea in termini generali dobbiamo in qualche modo cercare di coprire la maggior parte possibile degli ambiti settoriali d'azione dell'Unione Europea e effettivamente in molti di questi ambiti oggi si rinvengono delle dinamiche che sono quelle che lei richiamava, cioè il ricorso a meccanismi informali o meccanismi soft o comunque ibridi, no? Che non rispondono tipicamente alle categorie del diritto derivato. Questo ricorso è ormai abbastanza trasversale, si è sviluppato molto nei contesti emergenziali, ma di fatto ormai si sta consolidando come un approccio direi trasversale, istituzionalizzato per certi versi. Quindi questo sostanzialmente le richiederebbe di compiere un'indagine approfondita, perché questo è necessario in settori che sono molto variegati e anche differenziati. Per cui forse la scelta di individuare alcuni settori tra loro omogenei che possono rappresentare un case study particolarmente rappresentativo e magari questo va motivato in sede di scelta, potrebbe rappresentare una buona strategia. Mi occupo di un contesto, di un settore nel quale, come diceva lei, c'è un intreccio molto consolidato dei diversi livelli di esecuzione attraverso l'introduzione anche di organismi paragiurisdizionali, peraltro, anche a livello di Unione Europea, svolgo un'indagine in questo settore e poi nulla mi vieta in futuro di poter, come dire, estendere l'ambito e da qui partire per provare ad elaborare un ragionamento più diffuso, più articolato. Quindi a me pare che diciamo, lo sforzo che lei sta compiendo in quest'ultimo periodo di individuazione di un contesto specifico possa essere particolarmente come dire, apprezzabile, nel senso di dare maggior profondità all'indagine. Ora, questa ampiezza non riguarda, a mio parere, la questione dell'ampiezza, voglio dire, dell'ambito che lei indaga, non riguarda solo l'individuazione della politica o delle politiche, ma riguarda anche poi l'individuazione delle questioni che lei vuole toccare, cioè per esempio riguarda l'individuazione dei livelli di tutela giurisdizionale che lei vuole indagare, perché essendo quello dell'Unione Europea un sistema multilivello, no, ce lo dice l'articolo 19 del Trattato sull'Unione Europea, molto rilevante è anche la dimensione nazionale, per cui come dire, si tratta di capire, questa è una domanda che le faccio, se nella sua indagine lei si concentra, come mi è parso dall'illustrazione, più sulla dimensione sovranazionale di tutela giurisdizionale, e allora forse questo dovrebbe trasparire più chiaramente, oppure guarda anche ai meccanismi di tutela sul piano nazionale e a, come dire, anche la compliance di questi meccanismi di tutela rispetto all'articolo 19, rispetto ai parametri che sono stati elaborati dalla giurisprudenza della Corte di Giustizia. Non solo, c'è anche una questione di qual è l'oggetto del controllo giurisdizionale, cioè lei menziona diverse tipologie di controllo giurisdizionale, il controllo giurisdizionale sugli attori statali, cioè il procedimento per infrazione per intenderci, e quello che è invece il controllo giurisdizionale che viene svolto sulla interpretazione e legittimità degli atti ibridi che vengono adottati. Allora, anche qui capisco l'esigenza o l'interesse a voler coprire il più possibile tutti diciamo, i profili. Mi domando se come dire, non sia più utile soffermarsi su un profilo specifico che potrebbe essere quello della tutela giurisdizionale rispetto agli atti di esecuzione, agli atti ibridi informali che vengono adottati, cioè tralasciando, per intenderci, aspetti che sono interessanti ma magari non sono così come dire, originali, ma questo forse lo sa meglio lei di me, che sono relative all'adempimento da parte degli Stati membri degli obblighi di diritto dell'Unione Europea. Non so se ci siano molte questioni originali che possono emergere da questa analisi. Ecco. Quindi potrebbe essere utile anche cercare di restringere un po' l'oggetto della tutela giurisdizionale. Queste sono delle prime considerazioni che mi vengono in mente. Lei non ha menzionato, ma penso che nella sua indagine se ne occupi appunto di questi organismi paragiurisdizionali che sono stati in qualche modo creati. Qui si pone anche un problema di carattere istituzionale, no? Il ruolo di questi soggetti, la competizione di questi soggetti con i giudici in senso proprio. Sappiamo che c'è una tensione nascosta tra la Corte di Giustizia e questi organismi. C'è la possibilità però di istituire dei tribunali specializzati, quindi c'è anche una dimensione, come dire, che attiene al quadro istituzionale, no? e alla collocazione che questi organismi possono assumere in questo contesto. Mi pare che sia un tema interessante, soprattutto sempre nell'ottica come dire, del sindacato di legittimità prevalentemente degli atti che vengono adottati. Dico anche una cosa che un po' contraddice quanto segnalavo all'inizio. All'inizio dicevo forse conviene restringere un po' il focus, però nel restringere il focus magari qualche incursione negli elementi di prassi di altri contesti può essere utile, cioè ci sono degli elementi di prassi che riguardano per esempio la gestione della crisi migratoria, dove c'è stata una discussione su alcuni atti informali che sono stati adottati, tra l'altro non si sa bene da chi, secondo diciamo, le diverse versioni, o dall'Unione Europea o dagli Stati membri. Ecco, questi elementi che ormai hanno dato luogo, diciamo, a una prassi abbastanza delineata, potrebbero essere presi in considerazione come elemento utile nell'indagine. Quindi, ripeto, magari non estendere l'esame in modo puntuale a questi settori, ma magari compiere qualche riferimento più mirato, che peraltro dà un po' l'idea che ci sia un fenomeno che si sta sviluppando in termini trasversali. Da ultimo, ecco, non so quanto si possa dire di più e di nuovo sulla tematica dell'ocus standi degli individui. Mi pare che sia un tema rispetto al quale la Corte di Giustizia non intende muoversi dalla sua posizione tradizionale. Alla luce di ciò non so quanto tempo si debba, come dire, occupare nel ricostruire questo contesto, che ormai è un contesto abbastanza consolidato, a meno che non ci siano, diciamo, alcuni elementi anche sulla base della tutela che viene offerta all'atto nazionale, che permettono un po' di ritornare sul tema. Ormai la modifica di Lisbona che riguarda gli atti regolamentari è digerita, quindi ecco, non so se quel profilo, quell'aspetto le potrà riservare particolari sorprese. Io ho l'impressione che no, non ci sia molto da dire, purtroppo, o per fortuna, insomma, questo dipende un po' dai diversi punti di vista. Queste sono alcune considerazioni un po' sparse, mi scuso insomma se non sono stato ordinato e strutturato, che mi vengono in mente immediatamente. Non so se Fulvio, Giovanni.
Grazie innanzitutto e complimenti comunque per lo sforzo, e diciamo mettersi in gioco qui è sempre una cosa diciamo che può sembrare elementare, ma invece non lo è. Io chiaramente non posso dare per esperienza diciamo personale un contributo dettagliato come quello di Federico, che evidentemente è uno specialista. Qualcosa sul metodo e qualche considerazione di carattere un po' più generale che mi è venuto in mente. Innanzitutto, dalla lettura dell'abstract e dell'esposizione, diciamo, il primo consiglio che mi viene da darti attiene a come impostare la presentazione di un lavoro di questo tipo, nel senso, quando approcci, diciamo, introduci il tuo lavoro a qualcuno, parli del tema e dello stato dell'arte, ma poi c'è bisogno di chiarire ipotesi di lavoro e metodologia, che sono, diciamo, cosa vorrai verificare e come vorrai farlo. Questo si riesce a capire leggendo l'abstract e sentendoti, però diciamo, secondo me va esplicitato in modo più chiaro. Quindi prenderò questi istituti, questi principi, li utilizzerò in questo modo, farò una comparazione, come diceva lui, con altre esperienze, insomma, quello che preferisci, e quindi mi aspetto di verificare questi risultati. in modo tale che tu prepari il lettore, l'uditore a quello che vuoi dire e anche, diciamo, ragionando in questo modo riesci anche a tutelarti eventuali obiezioni, perché se tu spieghi perché hai fatto una scelta, spiegherai anche perché non ne hai fatta una, il che ti aiuta evidentemente a pararti da quegli attacchi che verranno dall'esterno inevitabilmente. Diciamo, ogni lavoro è apprezzabile o criticabile a seconda dei punti di vista. E ci siamo, diciamo, passati tutti. Quindi sicuramente da questo punto di vista mi sento di darti questo suggerimento. A un certo punto poi è uscito fuori il tema del dialogo tra amministrazioni. Secondo me quello va lasciato fuori, nel senso che è inconferente rispetto al tema del titolo e a tutto il resto, se no rischi di buttare dentro qualcosina e lasciare il tema un po' appeso, con il rischio che poi ti dicano introduce un tema e non lo tratta. E quindi questo è sempre diciamo, da evitare. Da ultimo, diciamo, l'unico rilievo di carattere sostanziale, io quando ho letto il titolo, che è il controllo giurisdizionale delle misure di applicazione del diritto dell'Unione Europea, mi sarei aspettato anche una analisi concernente il giudice interno sugli atti dell'Unione Europea o sugli atti di esecuzione del diritto dell'Unione Europea, un atto che recepisce una direttiva, per esempio. E qui c'è un problema gigante che lega poi, diciamo, i due settori, no? Ius 13 e Ius 14, è quello di quelli che vengono chiamati controlimiti, nel senso, io quanto posso andare come giudice interno andare a valutare il contenuto di un atto di diritto dell'Unione Europea o recettivo di un atto di diritto dell'Unione Europea. Mi vengono esempi più attinenti all'ambito delle relazioni private, perché diciamo, mi riguarda più da vicino. Nell'ambito del diritto internazionale privato, la Corte di Giustizia dell'Unione Europea afferma che gli atti del diritto dell'Unione Europea o molti atti recettivi di direttive sono atti di fatto costituenti un ordine pubblico dell'Unione Europea, cioè principi fondamentali del diritto dell'Unione Europea rispetto ai quali il giudice interno non ha margine di discrezionalità, li deve applicare e basta. E qui si innesta tutto un discorso di dialogo o scontro tra corti, perché invece il giudice interno, specie quello italiano, tende a resistere da questo punto di vista. È chiaro che questo tipo di discorso può essere esteso a tutti gli ambiti concernenti l'esecuzione degli atti del diritto dell'Unione Europea. E quindi, diciamo, forse, chiaramente non conosco un indice del lavoro e quant'altro, però potresti pensare di focalizzarti molto su questo, perché è il tema sul quale, dal mio punto di vista, c'è molto spazio per una speculazione dottrinale, cioè qual è il margine discrezionale del giudice interno rispetto a questo tipo di giudizio. E questo è. Grazie.
Eccoci. Allora, grazie. Anch'io voglio ringraziare il Presidente, la SIDI, anche se quest'anno diciamo c'è sta un po' di diritto come Vicepresidente, per avermi invitato a questo evento. È la prima volta che partecipo a questo evento, mi fa molto piacere. E quello che dicevamo anche ieri con i colleghi, questo tipo di attività, una sorta di retreatment dei dottorandi insieme appunto a professori e docenti, sono delle iniziative in realtà molto utili per tutti, sia per i dottorandi sia per noi professori, docenti, ricercatori, e anzi andrebbero in qualche modo moltiplicate, perché alla fine, diciamo, come dire, si riesce quindi ad avere delle vere e proprie discussioni in grandi libertà, senza, diciamo, l'ansia da prestazione che c'è in genere per un convegno che io continuo ad avere, quindi voglio dire, quindi questa, diciamo, in generale mi sembra una bellissima iniziativa. Allora, per quanto riguarda la tesi in progress della dottoressa Agrati, sicuramente quello che diceva Federico e che diceva anche la dottoressa Agrati sul restringere il campo, il focus della tesi, su questo siamo tutti quanti d'accordo, perché effettivamente sono tante questioni, tutte particolarmente complesse, quindi dovrà fare una scelta che poi secondo me si rifletterà anche sul titolo inevitabilmente della tesi, che non può essere questo. Io voglio fare soltanto un'osservazione, un po' diciamo in disaccordo con il professor Zarra, nel senso che questa parte centrale, che capisco diciamo che messa così sembra un po' fuori tema, cioè sul rapporto tra amministrazioni, quello che lei dice nel secondo capoverso, quando dice che la comparsa di nuove forme organizzative e procedimentali ha condotto a un intreccio via maggiore tra il livello di amministrazione nazionale e quello comunitario, poi dice alla fine questa commissione tra livelli, diversamente denominata dalla dottrina di matrice amministrativistica, merita un approfondimento, eccetera, eccetera, perché questo diciamo fa un po' da sfondo, almeno per come lei lo ha presentato alla sua tesi, però anche questa in realtà potrebbe essere un'ipotesi di lavoro. Dico ovviamente quello che penso da non comunitarista, perché qui si apre il grande tema, chiamiamolo quindi così, del diritto amministrativo europeo. Dico perché dico questa cosa, perché in realtà i manuali di diritto amministrativo europeo non sono scritti da comunitaristi e quando si legge un qualsiasi manuale di diritto amministrativo europeo poi si capisce che non si è di fronte ad una disciplina autonoma, perché in realtà in genere c'è un elenco di principi, la trasparenza, la partecipazione, eccetera, eccetera, che formerebbero questo diritto amministrativo europeo perché richiamati da leggi nazionali. Quindi, per esempio, nel caso dell'ordinamento italiano, dal 241 del 90, la legge sul procedimento amministrativo. Allora, in realtà, invece, quello che lei cerca di dire, o comunque diciamo viene adombrato già in questo abstract, è che in realtà anche quindi grazie alla nascita di queste agenzie europee, autorità amministrative nazionali, lei le chiama appunto nuove forme organizzative e procedimentali, tutto sommato forse diciamo al di là dei principi classici di matrice europea recepiti quindi poi a livello nazionale, forse quindi si potrebbero creare le basi, forse io non lo so, per parlare di un sistema appunto di diritto amministrativo europeo. E questo diciamo è la prima cosa che mi è venuta in mente leggendo questo abstract e quindi qui poi faccio un'osservazione ulteriore però. Se è vero, come dice lei, che in qualche modo, diciamo quindi così, progressivamente si sta realizzando uno spostamento, diciamo quindi così, del baricentro da amministrazione nazionale ad amministrazione europea, perché questo è un po' quello che lei dice, quindi anche nell'abstract, è una domanda che le faccio, se secondo lei questo tipo di fenomeno, se esiste questo fenomeno, sia un fenomeno apprezzabile, sia diciamo una evoluzione che va considerata quindi in senso positivo o meno. Cioè, questa per me può essere un'ipotesi di lavoro, perché io penso diciamo, che affrontare quindi questo tema rispetto alla maggior parte o una buona parte degli ambiti coperti dall'Unione Europea sia impossibile. Cioè, penso che per fare una cosa del genere ci vogliono 10 anni e non so neanche con quali risultati. Allora forse la cosa che io gli suggerirei, non dico che deve essere questa l'ipotesi di lavoro, è forse proprio partire da un'ipotesi di lavoro e capire se quanto ha studiato fino ad ora e quanto studierà nel tempo che le rimane prima di consegnare la tesi possa quindi suffragare appunto una ipotesi di lavoro, questa come un'altra ipotesi di lavoro, che poi era anche quello che suggerivano sia Federico che Giovanni. Questo è tutto.
Se posso aggiungere una cosa, poi magari non so se vuole avere la parola e poi apriamo alla discussione generale. Facendo un po' una riflessione su quanto dicevi e quanto diceva Giovanni, in effetti questo intreccio nella gestione e nell'implementazione amministrativa dell'ordinamento giuridico dell'Unione Europea, che è ormai abbastanza evidente, potrebbe anche essere il punto di partenza di una tesi che voglia riflettere sulla dimensione giurisdizionale che è complementare rispetto a questa struttura amministrativa. Cioè, se lei si vuole concentrare, cioè il focus del suo lavoro vuole rimanere sul controllo giurisdizionale, allora guardare come a fronte di un contesto sempre più ibrido e intrecciato sul piano amministrativo si è evoluto il sistema giurisdizionale multilivello. È davvero multilivello con l'unico ponte che è rappresentato dal rinvio pregiudiziale, oppure anche quel sistema giurisdizionale ormai si sta ibridizzando, contaminando, sta portando delle soluzioni differenziate. Questo potrebbe essere, come dire, un tema di indagine che muove proprio da questa dimensione che pure è meritoria di indagine. Sono d'accordo che un'indagine di un comunitarista sul diritto amministrativo europeo sarebbe utile. Insomma, è importante avere gli amministrativisti che se ne occupano o i pubblicisti, insomma, in senso generale, però anche un punto di vista di un comunitarista non guasterebbe. È un tema molto ampio. Allora mi domandavo, visto che, come dire, il focus del suo lavoro è comunque sulla tutela giurisdizionale, se non potesse essere una chiave di lettura quella di vedere se questa ibridazione sul piano amministrativo sta venendo a corrispondere un'ibridazione sul piano giurisdizionale, ma sto proprio ragionando mentre parliamo. Se vuole così.
Okay, grazie a tutti, vi ringrazio moltissimo per tutte le osservazioni e appunto partendo da quest'ultima in realtà sì, diciamo che sarebbe proprio questo il focus della tesi, non l'avevo letta ancora in questo senso, cioè nel senso di trovare dei punti di contaminazione forse anche più informali, paralleli diciamo nel sistema giurisdizionale a quelli del sistema amministrativo e appunto sicuramente sarà uno spunto di cui terrò molto conto e per quanto riguarda anche l'ultima domanda circa lo spostamento del baricentro, che il baricentro si sposti a mio avviso, da quanto ho potuto studiare, non è per forza un qualcosa di negativo, soprattutto perché questi nuovi soggetti sono dei soggetti che vedono una contaminazione fra piani, cioè i comitati delle agenzie non sono prettamente degli organi soltanto comunitari, ma che vedono anche degli elementi di nazionalità, quindi che preservano in qualche modo il doppio livello. A mio avviso diventa qualcosa di negativo nel momento in cui non vede una ricaduta in termini di tutela, cioè nel momento in cui le misure che vengono adottate non possono essere, non trovano nessuno sbocco appunto a livello di tutela dei singoli. E appunto questa era un po' anche la questione circa i livelli di tutela che volevo affrontare. Da un certo punto di vista allora, innanzitutto inizialmente mi ero concentrata sia sul livello nazionale che su quello comunitario, poi mi ero accorta che stava emergendo una tesi appunto quasi di diritto amministrativo, perché poi parlare del livello nazionale senza andare troppo a fondo nel diritto amministrativo è difficile e rischiava un po' di sviare proprio anche dal mio ambito di studio. D'altra parte però quindi da questo punto di vista vorrei cercare di affrontare entrambi i livelli, sono passata ad occuparmi di più di quello comunitario, vorrei riprendere anche quello nazionale trovando un modo di affrontarlo senza rendere appunto sviare troppo sull'ambito amministrativista. E per quanto riguarda invece i livelli appunto proprio di tutela, se parlare del sindacato giurisdizionale e basta, oppure appunto sugli obblighi, la procedura di infrazione eccetera, diciamo che il mio interrogativo che si sottendeva a questa tesi era quello di dire se ci fosse appunto alla fine una completezza di rimedi, cioè se in qualche modo ci fosse una ricaduta in termini di tutela che non sempre forse è una tutela classica dal punto di vista giurisdizionale, ma forse anche in maniera un po' più ampia, tant'è che anche da questo punto di vista per questo ero andato un po' ad indagare anche il livello proprio amministrativo per capire se perlomeno forse dal punto di vista dell'accountability politica in qualche modo questo tipo di accountability potesse sopperire ad una mancanza di accountability giurisdizionale e quindi se in qualche modo il cerchio riuscisse a chiudersi oppure se effettivamente ci fosse un vuoto. Però capisco e comprendo che è molto ampio e mi sono concentrata su molti aspetti e, come dire, è giunto il momento di tirare le fila e restringere. Certo.
Scegli un focus orientati, nel senso che se no rischi
Forse anche, diciamo, per non entrare troppo nel dettaglio dell'analisi delle soluzioni amministrative negli Stati, anche perché poi bisognerebbe fare analisi comparata, insomma diventa complicato, si potrebbe guardare in generale a quali sono i principi, cioè la griglia potrebbe essere rappresentata dai principi che la Corte di Giustizia ha chiarito in termini astratti, che attengono alla tutela giurisdizionale delle posizioni soggettive che derivano dal diritto dell'Unione anche nella dimensione interna, no? Quindi utilizzando i principi forse si può ricostruire un ragionamento anche che guarda alla dimensione nazionale. Rimane il fatto, mi viene in mente ora appunto che sono 27 poi i sistemi, quindi ancora una volta c'è un tema di ampiezza, ecco. Quindi forse i principi aiutano, ma d'altra parte poi devo vedere dove li vado ad analizzare.
Effettivamente questo mi sono veramente dimenticata di dirlo, il campo l'avrei ristretto, cioè sto studiando soltanto l'ambito italiano, quindi non sarebbe stato, ero partita con l'idea di fare una comparazione almeno col sistema francese, ma poi si estendeva troppo. E un'altra questione era quella sulla definizione di misura di applicazione, nella quale so di essere carente e sto cercando una mia definizione che possa appunto restringere l'ambito di indagine, proprio perché in realtà io escludo nel mio lavoro la trasposizione delle direttive, nel senso che avevo considerato come misura di applicazione il provvedimento amministrativo in senso stretto, quindi non ad esempio l'atto legislativo che trasponga la direttiva. Ma volevo andare, nel senso mi sono concentrata soltanto su appunto il provvedimento, comunque l'atto amministrativo generale, ma in senso stretto. Anche questa però capisco che è una definizione molto labile, perché poi vale in alcuni casi, in altri no, quindi sicuramente richiede di una ricerca di una definizione che possa appunto restringere l'ambito di applicazione.
Ottimo, io aprirei a voi, chiederei se ci sono certo.
Vabbè, la prima osservazione è quello che diceva Federico Casolari, mi ha molto colpito, nel senso che il rapporto è importante, non solo secondo me in termini del reperimento di un'eventuale prospettiva di parallelismo, ma anche magari di complementarietà o di sostituzione di un livello all'altro. Questo perché mi viene dalla mia, riflettevo prima con Beatrice, esperienza, come dire, di osservatore di certi fenomeni che si sono verificati nell'ambito delle Nazioni Unite. Seconda cosa, quello che dicevate tutti, e questa mi permetto di farla perché è un'osservazione di metodo di carattere più generale, è impossibile in una ricerca individuale pervenire alla soluzione di un problema di tale portata, ma allora forse questo per un verso potrebbe essere oggetto di una ricerca di carattere collettivo. Per altro verso implica un'ulteriore questione di tipo metodologico, e cioè per arrivare a qualche cosa di, diciamo, di sostanzioso, probabilmente questo implicherebbe l'impiego di competenze comparatistiche, perché se no tu non capisci come i sistemi si evolvono. E qui viene poi quel tentativo che avete fatto voi di fare quella rivista, secondo me è giusto dal punto di vista del metodo, perché se non c'è un'interazione tra questi due, diciamo, cosmi metodologici, secondo me si rischia oggi di non capire più niente, cioè l'internazionalista o il comunitarista, perché in questo caso si tratta di entrambe le figure, che crede di prendere un dato grezzo, secondo me sbaglia, diciamo, cade in un equivoco. Scusatemi, che è stato breve, insomma.
Ci sono degli altri interventi? Ecco, questo è un momento anche di dialogo tra di voi, quindi non deve essere solo, diciamo, un tormento, ma insomma, magari dai vostri punti di vista, nelle vostre indagini, c'è qualche elemento di interesse che volete condividere. Quindi
non deve essere un patto di non belligeranza.
No, per carità, possiamo vedere scorrere il sangue.
No, sto troppo bene.
Ah, no, c'è. Lorenzo. Presentatevi sempre così ci conosciamo tutti, anche se ci conosciamo già forse.
Buongiorno a tutte e a tutti, sono Lorenzo Grossi, sono dottorando all'Università di Milano Bicocca. La mia domanda è solamente una curiosità, perché mi aveva colpito molto nell'abstract e anche nella presentazione il riferimento all'analisi della discrezionalità tecnica e della discrezionalità amministrativa. Mi chiedevo, nell'ambito dello scrutinio da parte della Corte di Giustizia su atti che sono adottati da istituzioni europee che rientrano quindi poi nel tuo ambito di indagine, vedi dei collegamenti tra questo tipo di discrezionalità tecnica o amministrativa e quella che la Corte di Giustizia spesso ritrova nello scrutinio sulla legalità di atti legislativi adottati dalle istituzioni europee, ritenendo che sì, per esempio in materia di proporzionalità dovremmo valutare se la misura adeguata è necessaria in senso stretto, però allo stesso tempo il legislatore dell'Unione gode di ampia discrezionalità in materie che riguardano aspetti politici, economici e quindi lo scrutinio si limita poi a valutazioni circa il carattere manifestamente inappropriato. Mi chiedevo se vedevi una relazione tra le due, anche se in realtà poi l'analisi sulle direttive non è compresa ovviamente nell'analisi. Grazie.
Non ho affrontato il tema dell'analisi sulle direttive, quindi farei in questo momento fatica a trovare un parallelismo, però sicuramente perché la mia tesi si concentrava più nel piuttosto comparare il sindacato sulla discrezionalità del giudice nazionale rispetto a quello della Corte di Giustizia e capire se ci fosse una stessa concezione di discrezionalità tecnica amministrativa o diversa, piuttosto che fra vari sindacati della stessa Corte di Giustizia. Però grazie mille all'osservazione, ne terrò conto, potrebbe essere uno spunto anche per capire che cosa si intende per discrezionalità tecnica, se c'è un concetto comune al sindacato sulle diverse misure o se invece è inteso differentemente a seconda che l'atto sia legislativo o appunto esecutivo o amministrativo.
Peraltro su questo tema, che potrebbe essere un'altra tesi di dottorato, stavamo commentando, anche magari uno sguardo a giurisdizioni internazionali potrebbe essere utile, perché non è un tema che riguarda solo la Corte di Giustizia, ma insomma c'è anche una dottrina ormai molto corposa, no? sulla tutela giurisdizionale, quando la tutela giurisdizionale riguarda delle valutazioni che sono fortemente basate su dati tecnici, che ovviamente possono sfuggire alla conoscenza dei giudici, quindi quello insomma potrebbe essere interessante da guardare, però mi rendo conto che stiamo aprendo un altro mondo qui, quindi un punto di attenzione va messo, perché insomma lei dovrà davvero fare un'opera di definizione rigida, partendo da delle premesse molto chiare. Questo era un aspetto che non avevo detto all'inizio, però lo voglio evidenziare, cioè immagino ovviamente che la sua sarà un'analisi critica che muove innanzitutto dall'individuazione di quale dovrebbe essere il concetto di tutela giurisdizionale piena ed effettiva, quindi prima di tutto dovrà esserci un quadro ricostruttivo che guarda a questo concetto, forse anche delineandone luci d'ombre, e da cui poi muoverà, immagino, per compiere l'analisi e per parametrare i risultati a cui perviene alla luce dello stesso. Passiamo al prossimo. Allora, grazie mille a lei, a Giulia, per il suo intervento, bocca al lupo. E ora tocca a Federica Velli. Federica Velli ci presenta una tesi sul Principle of Sincere Cooperation in EU External Relations Law, è dottoranda all'Università di Cagliari con cotutela dell'Università di Lussemburgo, se ho fatto le ricerche giuste. Grazie mille, le regole di ingaggio sono le stesse.
Va bene, allora io prendo. Allora, buongiorno a tutti, mi chiamo Federica Velli, sono dottoranda al terzo anno sia a Cagliari che all'Università del Lussemburgo. Sono molto contenta di essere qui, ringrazio gli organizzatori e anche voi docenti per il vostro tempo e le vostre indicazioni sui nostri lavori. Il titolo provvisorio della mia tesi è The Principle of Sincere Cooperation in EU External Relations Law e la tesi è redatta interamente in lingua inglese e poi verrà discussa in lingua inglese e se, diciamo, io preferirei anche presentarla in lingua inglese, non so se la cosa per voi va bene oppure...
In inglese voleva, mi sono distratto perché
sì,
stavo... No, per me non c'è nessun problema e anzi così consentiamo anche a Olivia Corten di partecipare, quindi benissimo.
Allora, I will now continue in English to present the thesis. So today I would like to introduce the topic, make some comments about the methodology and the scope, then move on to the outline of the thesis, and lastly to make some comments on the contents of the main chapters of the thesis. So, as it can be already already understood from the title, the thesis will be about the principle of sincere cooperation, which is enshrined in Article 4, Paragraph 3 of the TEU. And this is a principle that entails duties of mutual assistance between the Union and the Member States, but also positive and negative duties resting on the Member States to give full effect to EU law and to ensure that the objectives of the Union are achieved. So, I'd like to begin by stating why I chose to talk about this in my thesis, and the idea to really go further on this topic came when I was attending an LLM and attending a course on EU external relations law, and I was made aware of the then pending opinion 119 about the Istanbul Convention, and so this opinion raises a number of complex questions, but I think the one that really struck me was the fact that all member states have signed this convention, which is within the scope of the Council of Europe. It's a convention that concerns the prevention of violence against women. And so all member states signed this convention. The Union also did so, but then some member states decided not to ratify the convention, and this in turn blocked the decision-making and the authorization process within the Council of the EU, which then resulted in the Union not being able to ratify the convention to this day. This practical case, this real-life case, really got me to think about how to ensure the unity of the external action of the Union when we have both the Union and the Member States acting on the international plane, how to reconcile the let's say, rather broad objectives that the Union has in its external action with what are the retained competencies of the Member States, and this got me to the principle of sincere cooperation. And and to understand actually what this principle can do and not do in a more concrete manner. So I will now go to the thesis itself. The thesis will look at the principle in the context of the external relations law of the Union, and wants to put really the focus on the principle and understand how this principle contributes to the external action of the Union, and it will do so from the point of view of the relationship between EU law and international law. This is a perspective that has not been sufficiently developed in the existing literature, which is rather ample on the topic, but This mainly scholarly literature has focused on following what have been the jurisprudential developments that have concerned this principle, so a progressive strengthening of the duties of sincere cooperations, which then resulted in limits to the independent action of the member states on the international plane. So what the thesis will do is then first look at the role of the principle of sincere cooperation when the Union exercises its external competencies to conclude international agreements and to participate in international organizations. And on the other hand, it will look at, once the Union has concluded international agreements, how then it complies with them within its internal legal order. So in terms of methodology, the methodology of the research is doctrinal, and it's mainly based on academic literature and the case law of the Court of Justice. And so in terms of scope, it starts from the premise that Union external competence already exists. So the thesis will not go further in examining how the external competence of the Union comes into existence and what its nature. Also, the thesis will not include the CFSP, not because Article 4, Paragraph 3 is not relevant, but rather because there is another provision which also refers to loyalty, which is Article 24, Paragraph 3, always of the TU. And yes, so these were some aspects relating to the scope. For then the structure of the thesis is made up of 5 chapters, which include introduction and conclusion. The 3 core chapters of the thesis concern first an analysis of Article 4, Paragraph 3, and then the 2 chapters at the heart of the thesis look respectively at when the Union exercises its external competence and then complies with the commitments in its legal order. So I will now go just to discuss a bit the contents a bit more precisely of these 3 chapters. So the first substantive chapters aims to provide a state of the art of how the principle is understood and interpreted, and focuses on the addressees of the principle, the content, the scope, but also wants to give a few insights on some of the, let's say, yet unsettled questions. For instance, the relationship between Article 4.3 and Article 4.2, which instead concerns the safeguard of the national identities of the member states. And this chapter will be then the basis for the next 2 chapters. So the following chapter will instead look, as I said, as to when the Union enters into international commitments. And here, if I have to really bring together and summarize the main contribution of the principle, in my view, this is the fact that the Union can act on the international state, thanks also to this principle, and in a way that it is not impaired by the fact that the member states are also actors on the international plane and they're pursuing their own interests. More specifically, I would like to highlight 3 concrete contributions of the principle. So the first is that it allows the Union to pursue its own strategy on the international level, so to conclude international agreements with third countries, for instance, cases such as Commission versus Luxembourg, Commission versus Germany, or to participate in international organizations putting forward its position, and here another well-known case is the PFOS case. Then other 2, let's say, contributions of the principle are the fact that the Union can engage on the international plane even when it does not have the full competence to do so, and this would be when it acts jointly with the member states. So here we would see, for instance, mandatory mixed agreements. but also then the management of mixed agreements in terms of voting rights, representation. So let's say the aspect of when the Union acts jointly with the member states. And finally, when the Union cannot actually formally take part in international agreements or organizations because they're only open to states, and therefore it acts through the member states as its trustees. So these are three main points that I would like to put forward in my chapter 3. And then I would move to chapter 4, which is instead concerned with the following steps. So once the Union has entered into international commitments, then how does the principle of sincere cooperation operate when the Union needs to implement them within its legal order? And so here, again, if I had to bring together what some of my, let's say, my main point in this chapter would be that the principle ensures that the Union can comply with its international commitments that are binding on it and that are also binding on the member states, according to Article 216 of the TFU, in a way that is both respectful of international law, but also allows the Union to preserve the autonomy of its legal order. And so, in particular, this chapter I titled it Compliance. And within compliance, I make two further subdivisions. One strictly relating to the implementation, so the incorporation of the Union of international agreements within its legal order, and then a section on enforcement, so how then the Union manages to ensure the compliance with its agreements. And so for the first subsection, what I will discuss is how the principle of sincere cooperation affects the implementation of different types of agreements that the Union concludes, as well as agreements that are binding on the member states, but that are still relevant for the Union. And then I would consider the fact that some international agreements have an intra-EU dimension and how the principle of sincere cooperation acts in that specific circumstance. And then finally, how the principle has affects the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice to interpret the international agreements that are binding on the Union. For what concerns instead the aspect on enforcement, I would like to emphasize two aspects. So enforcement within the Union legal order through the procedures within the Union legal order, such as the preliminary ruling, such as the infringement procedure. So both of which see the Commission and the Court of Justice as the main actor. And then enforcement outside of the EU legal order, so with the decisions of other bodies, other international bodies or courts. And then I'm also considering, but this is something that I'm still not sure about, because I feel it would be a bit like opening Pandora's box, to consider also the Union's participation in international dispute settlement. Because indeed, when the Union, it's not really exercising a different competence, but rather, yes, it's really the aspect of enforcing. But here, yes, there's a lot of interesting points also about the multilateral investment court. There's a lot of different considerations that could be taken into account. But yes, this is a point in which I would also like your views on. And yes, this actually concludes my presentation. The aim was really to give a bird's eye view of the different points that I'd like to cover, rather than going specifically in each specific point. And yes, so this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A brilliant presentation, and as you can imagine, at least for me, it's a very interesting topic. So good choice. I keep speaking English if you agree, just to to give you also, Olivier, the possibility to intervene if you wish. Just some general remarks and comments on what you have said so far, starting from the assumption that I think it's a good choice to focus your attention on a specific domain of implementation of the principle of sincere cooperation. And the external relations of the European Union, for sure, it's one of the most interesting and probably, let's say, developing context. You say that you are analyzing the way in which the principle is, and the duties related to the principle are shaping the EU's action, and you will try to make something different from previous analyses that were mostly based on the case law of the Court of Justice, trying to, let's say, look in the light of the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, the content of the limitations of the principle. I think it's impossible to try to elaborate the role of the principle of sincere cooperation for the EU without considering mainly the case law of the Court of Justice. And actually, in your presentation, you made several references to the case law of the Court of Justice. You started saying, oh, this is an interesting topic for me in the light of opinion 119, and then you mentioned other cases. So it's true that being a principle, a general principle of EU law, the case law of the Court of Justice is essential in order to identify its content. So I don't think you have to move, let's say, from this kind of analysis that has been already said. You can just add elements, or maybe you can just try to reconstruct a doctrine in a different way. But at the end of the day, what you have to consider is, of course, also the diplomatic practice of EU and member states, but also the case law of the Court of Justice. So maybe this could be something to be clarified a bit more at the end when you will have the floor again. Another point, you are referring to the action of the Union. But of course, this is not only a story of the European Union, this is also a story of member states. So maybe this should be clearer in your analysis, maybe also in the title. So we are speaking about the way in which the Union, together with the member states, is shaping its external projection. As you have said, there are cases where the Union cannot simply act, and so member states are supposed to act as trustees of the Union in the light of the principle of sincere cooperation. Of the EU is forced to act with the member states. And so I think the position of member states should be emphasized in your analysis and also in your topic, because the story is a story in particular about the states. And why this? Because, as you know, even though Article 4, Paragraph 3 says that the principle of sincere cooperation is mutual, so there are mutual obligations. When we, let's say, look at the obligations of the Union, of the institutions, we don't have, clear obligations. Maybe a need to, let's say, cooperate with the member states, but or maybe a need to take into consideration of international commitments of all the member states, intertanko, for instance. That's it, basically. So we don't have a clear understanding of the duties of the institutions. So that's why you are forced to analyze how this principle is shaping the member states' behavior, because the majority of elements of practice are related to the states, to the duties of states. And two concluding remarks. I'm not sure that the choice to keep outside the picture the common foreign security policy is needed, you have said that the choice is based on the fact that there is a different provision, which is Article 24 TU, but at the end of the day, Article 24 is a, let's say, concretization of the principle of sincere cooperation. I don't think that it works in a different way. I mean, yes, it works in a different way because the role of the Court of Justice is less relevant in the common foreign security policy. But at the end of the day, we are speaking about sincere cooperation. So I don't think that at least this is the only reason you can mention, okay, in order to make this choice. And last but not least, maybe it could be interesting to add some comments on the different ways sincere cooperation may, let's say, ensure proper enforcement of international obligations at EU level in comparison with the principle of international law, principle of good faith. This could be interesting to look at the differences and, let's say, to try to assess whether or not the principle of sincere cooperation may ensure a better enforcement of international obligations compared to, let's say, a genuine and pure implementation of a principle of good faith. So this could be something relevant in the concluding remarks you will give to your thesis. Sorry for taking the time, but this is, let's say, a topic that's it's quite close to me. Giovanni.
Thank you, and congratulations. Again, some very general remarks. One of them already emerged in Federico's remarks. I think it's very interesting to analyze how the interaction between EU and international law works through the principle of sincere cooperation. And I would go further in this regard. I mean, it's a very good starting point to say something also new. So I would further explore this point, as he already said, and go on in this regard. Secondly, another point which already emerged in Federico's remarks. I think the real added value of your work will be focusing on concrete cases. So on decisions, both from the Court of Justice of the European Union and decisions by domestic courts using the principles of sincere cooperation as a tool to implement the relationship between international law and EU law. I know that this is quite a hard task because going into the details of domestic jurisdictions is always complex. But still, if you are able to do so, it will be a real added value. In this regard, I recently, by chance, read about an opinion by an Advocate General in case C-10622, a case concerning Hungary, in which Hungary exercised the one that we called golden power. And I think here, you could find something, because in this case, the Advocate General said that the exercise of golden powers, even if golden powers are exercised on a EU company owned by a third-party country company, is legitimate, provided that it is inspired by proportionality and is based on national security or public order. So I think here you might find something concerning loyal cooperation also at the international level and EU law. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. The topic is very interesting and fascinating. But, I have one remark and one general question which I would like to put to your attention. First of all, that's just a suggestion. I would never say in a doctoral thesis that the current debate or the literature concerning this topic isn't sufficient, because we have many seminal books and articles concerning the European Union as an actor of international law. So in this regard, I would be a bit cautious. The second question is tied to what Federico said at the end of his speech, and I think that's the most problematic issue in your presentation. So first of all, it is not clear to me. So when you say that your thesis will bring to light the dual nature of the principle of sincere cooperation, which allows the Union to engage with international law and to comply with it, so it is not clear to me whether this is an idea of yours, or this is something which has been already said, I don't know, by the Court of Justice of the European Union. This depends on the fact that I'm not an EU lawyer, and so it's just a curiosity. But more generally, it is not clear to me whether, in the absence of the reading you are proposing of the principle of sincere cooperation, whether this would be a real problem. So it is not clear to me whether it is possible to reach the same result also in the absence of a principle like this, in the sense that, as Federico said, we have a lot of principles which can be used to the same end. Not, for example, the general principle of good faith. And so when you say, when you talk about the last chapter of your thesis, which should be the most important one, this chapter will address how the principle of sincere cooperation affects the Union's compliance with international agreements. So do you think that in the absence of this principle, the European Union compliance with international agreements, and let's say with international law as a whole, would be problematic? Because this is not clear to me. At least it is not clear by reading your abstract and by hearing your presentation. Thank you very much.
I would start by this final comment, for which was has raised a few further thoughts. But so my answer would be that yes, it would look different, the enforcement, because so in the context of compliance with international law, so it's kind of a mandatory starting point, so Article 3, Paragraph 5 of the TEU, and then Article 216 of the TFU, respectively, stating that the Union has a commitment to the full observance of international law, and at the same time that international agreements concluded by the Union are binding on it and on the member states. So this is the starting point, but then this does not really state much about what is the hierarchical level of international agreements, nor whether how this is rather a statement. In my opinion, it's a statement of fact. It doesn't quite state how concretely international agreements are implemented within the Union legal order. And so, in my view, what I argue in the thesis is that it's a combination of being an integral part of EU law, which is what the court states in Hageman, so that international agreements are an integral part of EU law, and as an integral part of EU law, the principle of sincere cooperation establishes duties on the member states to give full effect to EU law, and which includes the international agreements that the Union has concluded. So
if I interrupt you, but it's not clear to me.
Okay.
When you say that, it's clear, your point, but when you say that the principle has a dual nature, so this is a conclusion that you reach on the basis of what? Because this is not clear to me. It's just, a general theoretical idea, or something which, you would like to foster by your thesis, or this is something which can be proved on the basis of the practice of the EU Court of Justice, or I don't know what. That's the point, because that's the starting point of your project, and so that's a point which you should try to clarify, because at least to me it's not clear.
Yes, I will try to partially do so now, but I understand that perhaps but I would like to, because I mean, it's something that I also realize it's important. So the court itself uses the principle of sincere cooperation in a variety of circumstances, and it has also linked sincere cooperation as one of the elements of the autonomy of EU law. So the court already states this, for instance, in Opinion 109, which concerns the European Patent Court, and how the principle of sincere cooperation in terms of the dialogue between national courts and the Court of Justice in the preliminary ruling procedure, for instance, and ensuring that EU law is applied by the national courts is an element of the autonomy of EU law. And so I just want to emphasize this conclusion that the court has already come to, so the principle of sincere cooperation as an element of the autonomy of EU law, to really show that there is some kind of there is a relationship, there is a bit of a circular relationship between sincere cooperation and autonomy, in a way that, so if there is no sincere cooperation between the member states, so the EU law would not be sincere cooperation in terms of giving full effect to EU law within the national orders of the member states. There would be no autonomy from national law, whereas if the relationships between the member states would be governed by international law, there would probably be no sincere cooperation between the member states and the full effect of EU law internally. So this is something that I will make sure to clarify. But yes, this is not a conclusion. This is a conclusion that I want to, let's say, highlight. But I think this is already a conclusion that the court has come to, perhaps not stating it as, let's say, in such a forward manner as I do or I try to do in the thesis.
Okay, so at the end of the day, you are saying that this is something which can be, which is implied in the jurisprudence of the European Court, the EU Court of Justice. And so, sorry if I insist on this point, but you started. You moved from the assumption that your analysis is not tied to the case law of the EU Court of Justice. And so this is exactly what you are saying now.
I mean, I think it's impossible. Perhaps I misspoke, because this is the same point that raised Professor Casolari, and I think, I misspoke, but I don't mean to, of course, I think it's impossible to completely detach oneself from the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice. So I don't want to, let's say, to take away from that, and of course I will make full use of the jurisprudence of the Court, and I'm also not denying that there is already, I also said there is ample literature on this principle, much of which also from Professor Casolari, who is here today. So I'm not saying that, yes, there is not enough material. What I try to do is to take a perspective which is a bit different. Yes, so your point about so your point concerned
states together with the unions, the emphasis you put on the union.
Yes.
While maybe also member states could be included, because it's a story also about member states' duties, the lack of clarity on the EU's duties related to CC cooperation. And if I can just add to the debate, maybe you could try to clarify that the dual nature, because still maybe you have some doubts on this, on this dual nature, is related to the circumstance that it's clear that the principle of CC cooperation is also based on the principle of good faith, so on public international law. This is a nature, a soul of a principle, but this is something more, which is related exactly, as you have said, to the autonomy, so to speak, of EU legal order. So this is the dual nature. There are, I think, an advocate general of the court said that it's a qualified good faith principle, and so the nature is related on this, let's say, genus-based dimension is international law, but something more. I think this is, let's say, what you had in mind, if I'm not wrong, just to clarify to you that point.
Compliments for the issue, because I think it is very interesting, and the debate shows it. I think we have an elephant in the room. That is the domestic effect. I mean, probably we should, and I was also thinking the first thing as an international lawyer, who loves European Union law, but I'm an international lawyer, the first thing, as everybody, I thought was good faith in international law. But I think that probably when you speak about dual nature, probably you should speak about dual function of this principle, I think, to me. Because if you speak about international European Union's treaties that do not produce domestic effect, the sincere cooperation principle works in a way. If you speak about European Union treaties, I mean trade agreements, for instance, that should produce domestic effect, probably it works in another way. So I think that you should speak of international European Union agreements that have mere international effects and the one that have domestic effects. Probably, if you see it this way, you should see that the principle works in two different ways. Or it should. Why I'm saying it should? Because as we all know, trade agreements of the European Union, the latest one mostly, have a no direct effect clause everywhere. You see it as a model. And you should investigate how the two things work together. Because you said that the principle you are studying ensures the compliance. Ensures, it's a very hard thing to say. And on which level? On the mere international level? On domestic level? Probably this is a thing that, for me, probably I'm wrong, I do not know, is a thing that you should make it clear or clearer in your, just an observation, it's nothing more than this. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gianpaolo. Actually, it's a very important point, because you're right in stressing that the last more sophisticated treaties are lacking direct effect. So, and direct effect is related to the principle of sincere cooperation. Maybe we can collect other questions and then you can have the floor again for a short reply. Are there, please, don't be shy. Are there other comments? From colleagues also? No. Okay, maybe you can just reply to Professor Rotolo. And
so, first of all, thank you very much for the comment. So in terms of so the aspect of on the enforcement, what I so far considered was rather the enforcement at EU level. So not specifically at within the domestic legal orders, and I envisaged so the.
I was thinking to the domestic effect. I mean, international law affecting the European Union legal order, not in the national ones. It's what domestic for the European Union.
Yes. So within, for instance, so for infringement actions, there's not really direct effect. As an issue, but for instance, with the preliminary ruling procedure, direct effect is always a starting point when the court needs to then decide whether to yes, so there is the jurisdiction of the court, whether an agreement is within the scope of EU law, and when the action of a member state is within the scope of EU law. For instance, I think about mixed agreements, or even not if it's an EU-only agreement. But so what I would like to also argue, but this is also something that I'm still working on with regard to direct effect, is how sincere cooperation can add to what is direct effect. Does sincere cooperation in terms of the enforcement bring something more? Does it add to the primacy of EU law, which includes international agreements concluded by the Union? And in my view, it does from the point of view of effective judicial protection. So then linking it to Article 19 of the TEU. So direct effect, indeed, the court doesn't find direct effect many times. It's a very few times in which the court...
I would like to understand by which legal tools it happens. You say sincere cooperation reinforces judicial protection. You say sincere cooperation reinforces judicial protection. By which legal tools, legal instruments? Because if you have an agreement that does not produce any domestic effect, again, trade agreements, is there any difference with or without, just to do a trick of the mind, with or without the sincere cooperation? Or because if you say, no, it's just the same, probably you are saying sincere cooperation has no function at all. Yeah. I'm not sure I've been clear about what I'm saying, but just to invite you to think about this.
Okay.
Nothing more.
A sort of, our research question could be, what is the added value to rely on the principle of sincere cooperation in comparison with the principle of good faith, for instance? So this is the point. So this could be, let's say, the way in which you can look at the issue. And of course, this implies that you have to consider also, let's say, the ordinary way. So according to the principle of good faith, you cannot ignore this dimension, okay? So the added value of a principle of sincere cooperation in ensuring a proper enforcement of public international obligations. This could be a possible, point of view. Good. So I think now we all deserve a lunch. Which will be offered here in this building, or we have to move? Okay, here. So we, of course. Thank you very much indeed. And so now we have a lunch, and we will restart at 2:30 with the second session. Thanks a lot.